subcommittee for proposed strategies, pathways, and actions. Then we will have an opportunity for public comment and discuss next steps and adjourn. So with that, are there any changes to the agenda?
I don't see anything, Kristen.
All right. Well, I will hand it back to you then, David. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Kristen, and welcome aboard. It is a crazy time to join, I must say. Thank you for being up to the task. Okay, so we have our agenda. Jane has been pasting that into the chat. And as always, on the website, if you click on the meeting calendar, and maybe Jane can drop that link in as well, and Marion has a link to all our documents that we'll be working with today are posted online. So folks can follow along as we go. All right, so let's do the two things before we get into the meat of our conversation today. The first is the minutes. There is a hyperlink in the agenda to the minutes. Let me give us folks a second if they need to click through that link one more time and take a peek at that before we approve them. I'll give folks just a minute to do that. Okay, does anybody have any concerns about the minutes or would want a little bit more time to review them? Okay, great. So hearing no concerns about the minutes or requests for more time, we'll treat those as approved by you all. Thanks so much. So we're lucky to have Iris today to help us do a just transition reflection. So let me turn it over to Iris to do that. And Iris, I have prepped up on my screen that piece of video, that video you wanted. So just let me know when you need it, and we can share that.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. And the Wi-Fi here tends to be a little spotty, so please let me know if I cut out. But I really wanted to thank you all for giving me the time and sort of explain why I asked for it. So I'm just taking this time because I think that we need to just recenter ourselves in why we're doing this work. And so I also want to start by saying that I'm here as an individual and a counselor and not on behalf of the Just Transition Subcommittee. But I wanted to make time at the beginning of what's going to be a substantive meeting to just recenter us on the urgency of the climate crisis. And so I was up last night looking at a few clips of these speakers because I think that there are people who say things much more eloquently than I do. And well, I think that the council needs to hear about the ways that action and justice applies more specifically to our process and the situation. I really wanted to share this short clip because it's really powerful and it sums up what I want you all to have in mind when we're doing these conversations. And I want to say, I know that you all know these things. It might sound like it's talking down to you. I know you know these things, but it's a good reminder. It's a really great reminder for all of us as we jump into this work, because I don't think that we've talked enough about the reasons we are actually doing this work, because it in the end actually isn't that we're going to get sued, and it's not because we have statutory requirements, it's because we should be doing this work. So if you wouldn't mind pulling up that video, that'd be great.
Sure. Give me 1 second to get the settings right, and I'll be right there. Okay, let's give it a try.
I come from Uganda and I live in Kampala. Generally, this is a country that has one of the fastest changing climates in the world. Because of the rising global temperatures, the weather patterns keep changing. And my country, Uganda, heavily depends on agriculture for survival for many communities, especially those in the rural areas. So it means a lack of rain means hunger, starvation, and death for very many people. And extreme rainfall also means destruction, it means hunger, means starvation, and leaving many people homeless. Historically, Africa is responsible for only 3% of global emissions, and yet some Africans are already suffering some of the worst and brutal impacts of climate change. So what we really want is a future that is healthy, that is sustainable, that is clean, that is livable and equitable for all of us.
What do we want? Climate justice! When do we
was inspired to start the Rise Up movement in 2019. The moment when I felt it was really bigger than when I started, it must have been in September 2019. That is when I got an invitation to the UN Youth Climate Summit in New York at that time, and I was surprised to get that invitation, and I never really expected it. I think very many older people are not so comfortable talking about the truth of the matter. I think young people realize what's at stake. Young people see the kind of future they are walking into, and they are not afraid, to talk about the demands that they have from the leaders or from the governments.
People united will never be defeated.
What we really want from the older generation is for them to stand with us in this time when we are speaking up, when we are rising up and demanding for climate justice. You cannot leave this responsibility to the young people.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And just, I am so inspired by Vanessa Zapata all the time. And she is right now doing all this work with COP26, and we all have been doing our work in the context of global action and national action. So I think that's an important thing to remind us of. And so I mean, I know that we all know the reason we're doing this work, but we haven't been able to call it out in this conversation as explicitly as I had hoped that we had throughout this process. And we talk a lot about the deadlines and statutory requirements and lawsuits, but I want to remind us just at the beginning of this meeting that those are not why we're doing the work. And we're doing this work because it's necessary for the good of our communities and the world, and we do it because we need it. And I know I said that, but I think that's just really, really important going into this meeting and all of our the meetings to come, which there will be many, and they will be long, and we will be getting into the nitty gritty of this, but we haven't said it enough. So even more than the urgency of the climate crisis, we have really failed to articulate in these meetings ways that injustices are the cause of that crisis, and the way that inaction will lead to worse injustices. So we all know that the climate emergency does not know the borders of our state and our nation, but we forget to say to each other and recognize just how global this issue is, because that's the way that the statute has defined our work. But I think it's important that we take a step back and realize that we are doing this not just for Vermonters, and we need to consider justice for not just Vermonters, but for the world. And we've failed to articulate the things that we are thinking and considering, but in making them more silent in this process, we have really lost the power that comes with talking about them, because maybe we are all thinking about this, maybe we are all centering it in this work, but if we aren't talking about it while we are doing this, it is not as powerful. And I know we all know this, but I think it's important to formally recognize the fact that the climate crisis requires urgent action. And it is one of the most pressing issues facing the world today. More than that, we have to recognize the outsized role that Vermont and the US has played in creating the problem. And the fact that our state is going to be sheltered from the worst impacts of the climate crisis. I want to make sure I'm saying explicitly that doesn't negate the harm that will come to Vermonters and the harm that Vermonters are experiencing, and it doesn't erase the hardships. And it surely is not an assertion that Vermonters will not die of climate change, because they will, and they have. But instead, I'm trying to pull at the inherent injustice that comes with a changing climate. And while Vermonters are suffering from breathing in the smokes from the fires out west, the people out west are suffering from the fires themselves. And that is true of all of these different things that we are seeing and experiencing. So because the effects of the climate crisis are not felt equally, and no one deserves to suffer the way that they will, the progression of the climate crisis is a perpetuation of injustice. It exacerbates all of our existing inequities. And inaction, being that it provides for the worsening of the climate emergency, is therefore an injustice. And we need to do this work, because not doing it is actively harmful. And now, just because like inaction is bad, that doesn't mean that all actions are created equal. That doesn't mean that we can pick any of these things that we have brought up. It does not mean that you can't do a really great thing badly. But in the end, taking action is a good thing. And I will be the first to tell you that this process has lacked procedural equity, and that we need to do better, but we've discussed that. And I believe that we've spoken to it in a way that we have missed the inherent injustice and justice that comes from inaction and action, respectively. And so I just wanted to take a moment to remind us of how much we need climate action, because that is at the center of what we've been doing, and yet it hasn't been said. And I want to recognize the way that inaction is also a policy decision, but it's the wrong one. And I think we've been thinking about this in terms of taking action as a decision and not taking action as indecision, but inaction really is a choice to continue the policies of the past. And I want to bring forward the fact that we aren't beholden to this work because of deadlines or statute, but because we're accountable to the people that are currently suffering and the generations to come that will suffer if we don't take these actions. And understand that while taking the meaningful action is a step forward towards the justice we need, those actions must be implemented correctly, because good actions still have the capacity to be really harmful if they're not implemented right. And so hopefully this was short and sweet, because I know how much we need time to do all these things in the agenda, but I wanted to have time at the beginning of the meeting just to renew our focus on the reasons we're doing this work, and ask that we all try and center this throughout the process. And we're going to get through some substantive conversations this afternoon. And I want to ensure that in the forefront of everyone's minds is the need for justice, because justice looks like equitable climate action, and it's the reason we're doing this work, not just emissions reductions requirements and deadlines. The issues we're trying to address in this plan are huge, and they're global, and yet is so important that we do our part, because failing to do so would actively harm so many communities, both inside and outside of Vermont's borders. So thank you all so much, and I'm looking forward to digging into it, but I want us to just take a moment and remember why we're doing this. So yeah, thank you.
Nice. Thanks, Iris. I certainly open up a space if others want to react to that before we dive in. I see a lot of nice feelings in the chat, and people's screens here. Okay. All right, so there's a lot of motivation here. Shall we move on? I'm happy to pause for a second if folks want to say anything, and I'm happy to dive into our content today as well, to do the hard work of moving beyond inaction. Okay, let's dive in. The way we've structured today is to spend about an hour and 15 minutes or so, or an hour and 20 minutes on rural resilience subcommittee recommendations, take a break, and then spend another hour, 15 minutes, 20 minutes on the ag and ecosystems subcommittee recommendations. We also have scheduled time tomorrow morning to finish up the pieces that we don't get to today. So you'll see in your calendars on Wednesday an opportunity for us to circle back and address the things that didn't get addressed in the sort of hour and 15 hour and 20 minutes that we have to dive into issues today. That's our strategy. All the co-chairs in our last meeting had offered to forego a presentation that walked through point by point of pathway strategy and action. However, I do want to give co-chairs an opportunity to open up this conversation in the way you would like to. I have prepared a document on the basis of the survey results for those of you who answer the survey. that tries to synthesize some of those issues. And we got those together yesterday. So I know co-chairs have had a chance to look at these. So my idea was to walk through that document, and I've signaled the ones that seem to be highest priority in terms of a conversation. However, before we do that, let me turn it over to the Rural Resilience co-chairs, Eric and Catherine, if there's some way you'd want to frame up this conversation or some opening thoughts you want to offer before we dive into the specific issues that have been flagged.
Catherine, would you like me to start?
Sure.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody. I'm pretty pleased to have the opportunity to talk through this section. I think we as co-chairs and several members of the committee who are here with us today, very proud of this work, and recognize that had we had a bit more time, it would be even better. I think what we have here is a balance of ideas that need a bit more fleshing out, but also an expansion of practices that are tried and true in Vermont in increasing resilience and adapting to climate change. I do want to thank the subcommittee members that are taking the time this afternoon to join us. As you know, I'm certainly not a subject matter expert on all of the areas that are included in Section 12, and so we may be deferring some questions to folks that are on the line with us. I just also want to highlight that if it feels like there are chunks of this that are missing, chunks that really, categorically would belong in building resilience in communities and the built environment, it may be because they are sitting over in the cross-cutting pathways section, which will be discussed next week. So it's just something to keep in mind as we talk through this. Catherine?
Well, you've said almost everything I had on my list. The only thing I'll add is that we do have some work that the statute still calls for us to do that is highlighted or alluded to in our the written report that you got from us. But specifically included in that is a municipal vulnerability assessment. And that is going to be a pretty key piece of our work that we embark upon after this December 1st deadline, hoping to build tremendously on the work that's been done by the Department of Public Service and Green Mountain Power, and incorporate into that so much of what we've learned through this process about just transitions and the other issues that we've tackled. So that is a key piece of our work that's still yet to come. And so I want to make sure everybody was aware of that. And then my question for the facilitator, David, I know we tend to just have the Climate Council members turn their cameras on. Would it be appropriate to invite any steering committee subcommittee members who are here who would like to turn their cameras on to please do so?
Yes, I think that's a great idea. Thanks, Catherine.
So if there are some subcommittee members out there who are joining us who would like to put their camera on from our Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee, please feel free. Thanks, Mike. I was hoping you would do that.
Welcome, everybody. Okay.
And Joe.
All right. So Catherine and Erica, would you be comfortable if I shared sort of my summary of the key points, and then we can kind of tick through some of them? I've marked some of them as sort of at the top of the list because I feel like they're the ones where we really needed some resolution for the council to feel comfortable. There's other ones that are more, have a flavor of suggestion and suggested improvements kind of thing. So let me walk you through my screen, and this is this document should be online. So I believe, Jane, this got posted this morning, so it's on that page with everything else. But here's the document that can guide our conversation today. It's quite similar to the one we used the other day with the cross-sector subcommittee. This is a summary of key issues. You'll see we had 7 responses from counselors. So there could be other thoughts out there, just saying. But of the 7, and thank you for the 7, because it is so helpful to get that early view of the concern. These are some of the big ticket items, and I'm just sorting out my screen real quick so I can continue to see you all while I'm talking. The ones I put in red here are the ones that I felt probably really need the most conversation today and or tomorrow. There's some additional ones below that may or may not require the council to have a conversation. They are inputs that the subcommittee can use in a final revision getting into December 1st. Here's some of the big ticket ones. Let's walk through them quickly, and then we'll circle back and we'll take them one by one. One is about the language around eliminating statutory barriers for school and municipal solar participation. And here there's a real specific concern about that kind of language doesn't take into account the cost on ratepayers. And there's a specific request to change that language, adapt that language so that that's not a likely outcome of what's being suggested. And this is from Liz. And so Liz, I'll let you speak to that in a second specifically and see if there's a pathway towards resolving that concern. Another concern was around the way water infrastructure is spoken about in the document and it not being all that well aligned with the way, say, A&R typically talks about it. So is there something that needs to be done around that so folks can see sort of the pathway from the way it's typically discussed and the way it's discussed in this document? There was a call out about the issue of villages in floodplains and how are we really grappling with this possibility, or here it's written as the notion that relocation may be part of our story here. And this may be part of this. This may be one of these things that ends up in that cross-cutting group, but let's see that in a second. I have 3 others here that are in my sort of red list of this. There was a question about why the funding, this recommendation about how to fund road projects and how to adjust the fact that as we electrify the fleet, the fuel tax won't be a solid, reliable, sustainable funding mechanism. Why is this in this group? There was a question about that, and we can talk about whether this belongs here or somewhere else. There was a question of a missing issue about drought impacts on drinking water. And finally, there was a suggestion, and this is a very specific suggestion about including these hazards, heavy rain, hail, sleet, high winds, in the very first pathway and strategy for the toolkit. Okay, there are a number of other pieces that that felt more like suggestions or flags, but it wasn't clear that they require a conversation. They may, and so they're here and we can jump on them if we want to. These felt like the top recommendation, or excuse me, pieces of feedback that we should get into right away. All right.
And David, I should note that the co-chairs along with some task leads did meet yesterday to discuss these comments. So we will be able to address them as appropriate in this conversation.
Wonderful. Okay, that's great. So let's start with this one about eliminate the statutory barriers. I think I'll drop my screen in just a second so we can see each other as we're talking. But this feels, this is something that Liz, you brought up specifically. And I wonder if you want to just say a piece more about it, or if there's anything else you would like to say about this. And I understand Catherine and Eric have talked a little bit about it, so maybe there's a quick fix. But Liz, I'll turn it over to you if there's something else you want to say about the concern here and the way that language is right now. Oh, you're on mute. Hang on one sec.
Sorry, I managed to put on camera, but not off mute. Yeah, no, I think the comments there capture it. I mean, I don't know exactly what the subcommittee was going for. And when I read it, it felt like in other places in the Climate Council discussion, we've talked about having more local generation, including for municipalities or other targeted schools, farms, et cetera. And I didn't know what the statutory barrier was. So to the extent it was meant to be talking about net metering, there are other potential ways forward. So if the language suggestion change there is good and not problematic, that would be one way to handle it. Otherwise, it would probably need some further explanation as to what it's even going for. I'll stop there and you can get other reactions.
Thanks, Liz. Catherine or Erica, do you want to weigh in on the conversations you've had about this?
Sure. Thanks, Liz, for that comment, because it really highlighted the need for us to be a bit more specific with this action. Really, the intent of this action was to really focus on the statutory barriers related to financing land lease and purchase that can get in the way of the process of putting renewable energy on municipal and school properties, and we did not discuss the net metering piece of that. So your question was right on in terms of pointing out the lack of specificity there. So I think there's a way that we can, we've lost your screen, David, at least I have.
Oops. Okay. Is that better?
There's a way that we can reword that to add some specificity. And also I would say, I like your addition of the cost-effective programs as part of that as well.
Great.
Okay.
And
Great.
Chad also wanted to add.
Yeah, no, thank you. And, Catherine, I'm happy to help sort of craft this language, because I agree with Liz. I would not want to see this longer term document, the CAP, be reflective of current policy that could and likely will change in the not too distant future. There's going to be other avenues beyond net metering to deliver clean renewables to schools and communities. So yeah, let me know if I can help with that language.
Thanks, Chad. Okay, so just to be clear, what the concern expressed by Liz is being addressed by greater clarity about what barriers you're referring to. And there's no suggestion in this that we're trying to talk about net metering. That's not what we're doing here, right? Okay.
Correct.
Great. Okay, so with that, does this get resolved with those two clarifications? Yeah.
Sounds like it probably will. Yeah.
Okay, great. Anybody else? Rich, you trying to jump in there?
Yeah, I was just going to add that while it seems like this recommendation is not focused per se on net metering, that Liz's recommendation towards a cost-effective approach that would promote municipal and school distributed generation is a good one, and that there's a positive aspect to the recommendation beyond just eliminating the financial barrier that Catherine touched on. So there's both an elimination point here and a proactive point that I think we should not lose.
I agree.
Great. Okay, wonderful. Anything else on this issue? Okay, super. Thanks. I'm just going to keep rolling here. Slow me down if folks want to slow down, please. And we're taking notes, and I will try to feed those back. It's a little hard for me to share my screen and take notes at the same time, so it seems like I'm dropping you if I do that. But Cameron's here to help, and we'll make sure we capture this. And also we're recording. Okay, the next one is about the alignment of language. And Julie Moore, Secretary Moore, I think this was coming, at least part of that was coming out of your concern. And I wonder if you want to say a word more, and then let's hear how Eric and Catherine have thought about this to date. But Secretary Moore, let me turn it over to you.
Sure. I just flagged that I'm mostly concerned that we're creating sort of different ways of organizing the same types of practices and projects. Appreciating from a conversation with Erica, an email exchange with Erica this morning, that this is language suggested by staff at ANR. I've gone and talked to the program about what my concerns are and think they're going to try to work to address them. It just, there are going to be challenges either way, in creating language that may feel more publicly accessible, but doesn't actually match then the programs and both regulatory and funding that the agency administers. I think will create other understanding challenges. And so we'll work with the team to help address that issue.
Oh, sorry about that. That seems like a pathway towards resolution. Chris, you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I guess, Secretary Moore, I guess I'm just wondering, then does that mean, does the misalignment, does that mean what the A&R structure is what it needs to be and it doesn't need to change? Or do you disagree with the approach that's proposed? Or I mean, is this more of a kind of, we can't change the policy because the policy is what it is? Or what? I guess I'm just looking for more detail about what the concern is.
I'm trying to bring up my comments quickly, Chris, because I didn't have the document open. But as I recall, there were categories of like gray, green, natural, and one other kind of infrastructure. That's not the way we talk about or manage infrastructure at the agency. Certainly there's green stormwater infrastructure, which is a subset of stormwater infrastructure. We have natural resources restoration projects. It was creating a new set of words. And it's probably more semantics than any functional concern that I have about the way that those actions were presented.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Okay. Anything else on this particular issue that we need to address?
Could I invite Joe to just note the resolution I think he's already found?
Oh, nice. Okay.
I think Secretary Moore already addressed that. Neil Kamen has already gone in and made some edits to the comments, and so we have those and pass those along, and those will get incorporated.
Great. Okay. Sounds encouraging. All right. The next one is a little is going to be more interesting and tricky, and in part because I wonder, Catherine or Erica, if you could help out with this next one. This is a comment that came in that said, as it's, this is just me cutting and pasting the comment. Should we be thinking about the fact that a lot of historic villages are on rivers and floodplains? How do we grapple with the notion that may make the most sense to relocate some villages in their entirety, right? And so how do we understand that comment in the context of what's in the document, and how we need to address that kind of comment? And maybe you want to point us to actually what's in the document now.
I don't think this comment was, well, maybe I didn't interpret this comment to be drawing upon any singular action or any singular strategy. This is something that we talked about yesterday, and it's a question that we get a lot, and I'm sure the folks at like ANR and the Rivers program get, when we talk about, well, how are you going to make these communities immune to flooding when many Vermont communities were built along rivers because we were, agricultural communities. And the answer is not a one-size-fits-all solution for every single community in Vermont. It can't be. The answer is to ensure that we have the tools that are accessible, and that local communities have capacity to utilize those tools and can utilize those tools to their advantage based on a vulnerability assessment and an understanding of their risks, and can utilize them to either harden infrastructure, relocate infrastructure if need be, or take a broader look at the upstream and downstream impacts of flooding on their communities, and to take actions based on those variety of factors that are at play.
And that's what the document says now, essentially.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it is a question I get a lot from folks. So they shouldn't be on the river. Well, it's not that simple, and it's not that straightforward. And I think many of us are probably nodding our heads in agreement with that. But, you know, like you said, many of the recommendations that are in here are about expanding and establishing tools for communities to be able to use, ensuring they have the capacity to utilize them, and ensure they're risk informed.
Thanks, Erica. Okay. Are there other things we want to say about this, and particularly as it relates to any kind of changes that we think these recommendations should see? Is there anything in the way these recommendations are written on this topic that folks would like to see a little different? Okay. All right. Great. Anything else then before we move on to the next thing here?
I'll just thank Bram for not shying away from the hard questions. I think that came from him.
Yep. Excellent. Okay. So we have this recommendation in the package here that talks about the way that transportation infrastructure will be funded, and put some ideas out there. And there's a question about, does this belong here? If not here, where? I wonder, Catherine and Erica, did you have a chance to think about that and react to this comment?
We did actually, and I think we could probably lean on Joe Segali, who was one of the writers of this particular action. He really articulated what was behind this very well yesterday. If I could lean on him to speak up about it.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Joe Segali. I'm the Director of Policy Planning and Research at the Agency of Transportation. And what this is really about is making the transportation fund resilient. It's kind of a secondary impact of climate change. And so, the electrification of the fleet is going to mean that we're losing money. And, if you look at the 170,000 vehicles or so, that's the target, I think, for 2030. That's an impact of $20 or $22 million. And then you carry that forward out to 2050, it's an impact of about $50 million. And so, that's all money that we use to match federal funds. It's all money that we can use to implement all the other recommendations that are coming out of the Climate Action Plan. So I guess others can decide if it makes sense to have it in the plan or not, but that's why it's there. And it's under pathway 2, which is about infrastructure resilience, and the last strategy, which is about approaching infrastructure resilience from a system-wide perspective. So it's one of those sort of bigger issues. Funding is obviously a system-wide issue. So that's why it's in there.
Great. And for folks who don't know, what is the AOT study evaluating road uses charges?
We're evaluating ways to replace the lost gas tax revenue. There's several alternatives that we're looking at. One of them is just a across the board flat fee for electric vehicles. Another approach, which has all sorts of options to it, is a mileage-based user fee, or sometimes called a vehicle mile.
One of her colleagues at Efficiency.
Hang on one.
But I can get you.
We just have someone with a open mic. If Jay.
Oh, no worries. Hold on just 1 second.
If you'll.
So we're doing that right now. We're in the middle of evaluating that, and it's likely that we'll be doing some piloting and trying to figure out what works best. And the piloting will include lots of outreach, and so that's where we are with it right now.
Okay, great. Rich, and then Secretary Moore.
Yeah, I have a concern that this recommendation says to implement the recommendations of the study, as opposed to consider the recommendations of the study, unless we're prepared to actually recommend adopting the results of a study that we haven't seen. That's one point. A second point is, I think there are some really thorny questions here about the allocation of costs in support of the road network. A lot of the costs of the road network, for example, according to prior studies, have a lot to do with the weight of vehicles. And so allocating costs across different classes of vehicles purely on a mileage basis would be problematic when weight is one of the main cost drivers for the road system. And second concern is that here we are trying to accelerate the deployment of electric vehicles by incentivizing their purchase. And while I agree that we have to figure out a way to pay for the road network and other transportation services equitably and cost effectively over time, this is really a complicated area. I'm just not sure that the Climate Council is ready to come down on one side or another of these complicated cost allocation questions.
Thanks, Rich. Okay, so there's a study that's not complete, and the concern is, how are we endorsing a study that's not yet complete? Okay, and with the specific concerns you mentioned. Secretary Moore?
I'd maybe just build on some of what Rich flagged there, in that I also think this conflicts a little bit with one of the recommendations coming out of the Cross-Sector Mitigation Committee to sort of subsidize EV charging rates as an incentive for spurring EV adoption. And I agree that there's a real need to dive into this. I do think it's sort of outside of the purview of the Climate Council and Climate Action Plan, and should be teed up as an issue that needs to be addressed, either as a cross-cutting issue potentially, because it does touch on, as Joe indicated, some of the resources available to VTrans then to do some of the critical planning and resilience work, but at the same time recognizes that this is a solution that I think has, or an issue that has tentacles into a lot more things than simply climate action.
Thanks. Bram?
So very quickly, the Tax Structure Commission did examine this issue, and while supporting financial incentives to move to electric vehicle charging, did feel that as a matter of fairness, electric vehicle drivers should pay their fair share of supporting the road system. I think it would be a perfectly rational decision to say we want to further incentivize electric vehicle owners so that they don't need to pay road tax. However, I think we need to be careful of cost shifting the entire burden of paying for the roads onto a smaller and smaller number of people driving gas-powered cars. So if we're not going to have electric vehicle owners pay their share of road maintenance, we should find some other funding mechanism other than a shrinking pool of gas-powered cars. And one other thing to address Rich's point that weight matters. There are plans, and I'm sorry, I don't remember which states are examining these, but there are proposals to tax vehicles based on their maximum gross weight times the number of miles traveled each year. And we've got the technology exists to track that stuff pretty easily. So there are solutions, but I also agree it may be beyond the purview of this council. Thanks.
Okay. So we've heard a couple concerns here about a recommendation from you as a council to endorse something that hasn't come out yet and something that has a lot of sensitivities to it. I'm wondering what the pathway is for you all then on this, or pathway is the wrong word, what you want to do about this.
David, can I say something, please?
Yeah.
Sorry, I can never figure out quickly enough how to raise my hand. I apologize.
All good.
So I think this is a bit out of the purview right now, and I also think it's a bit premature. The Agency of Transportation was asked by the legislature to produce this study. And the study is intended to be delivered to the legislature, I believe, in January. But yet the cap has to be delivered to ANR December 1st. So I think whatever the legislature gets from the study and the conversations the legislature has on a very relevant topic, by the way, of course, what are we going to do with the increasing use of electric vehicles and the declining revenue stream from the current makeup of how we generate state funds for transportation work. So that's a very relevant topic, but I just think it's premature to put it in here. And it's something that's intended to be given to the legislature for their discussion. And they may end up legislating a way forward, which sort of makes this conversation perhaps a bit moot. Thanks.
Joey, and then I want to quick take the temperature of the pathway here. Joey, go ahead, please.
Thank you, and appreciate the subcommittee raising it, and I appreciate the comments and the general sentiment. And it certainly has been something on our radar, and didn't feel like we had the time and certainly the expertise or capacity to tackle it. I think it should be tackled elsewhere. I do wonder if it shows up, as Secretary Moore mentioned, as a big flag, either in the cross-cutting or potentially under the funding and finance section. Like, this is a massive funding and finance issue. So I would love for it to be flagged as something that absolutely must be wrangled with, informed by the AOT study. But so I hope that we can recognize it, appreciate this big thing we must tackle, and where it shows up, but potentially that's one idea.
Okay.
That seems like, to me, a good way to land, and we can run that through our subcommittee when we meet. It seems like to have the climate action plan be silent on this issue would seem odd. So I like your suggestion, Joey, of noting it, note what's going on with this study effort, and flag it as an issue that needs to be addressed.
Okay. So specifically what we're suggesting here is to modify what's here to say, we're noting this problem, we're noting the study going on, and we know this issue needs resolution, right? That's what you're going to say. You're not going to say the council implements or supports the implementation of this study because we don't know what the results of that study are yet. Okay. Is that what you're trying to say, Catherine?
Joe, what do you think about that from your task group?
I think that's fine.
Okay. Right. Does anybody have a concern with doing it that way? Noting the issue, noting a study's happening, and noting this needs resolution as a sustainability issue for transportation going forward. Okay, great. All right, let's go back on some other issues. I have two more that are on my list. Instead of sharing my screen, I'll just drop them in the chat because they're short. This is one of the issues, a missing issue, drought impacts on drinking water. Catherine and Erica, when you saw that, what did you think?
So we did note there are a couple of different places where drought comes up, where we have actions that are specifically to tackle not only the impacts of other hazards, but also drought, specifically in pathway 2, and then more extensively in pathway 4. Really looking at water source protection, contingency water sources for communities, as well as, I have to pull it up again, but hardening our current water supply infrastructure.
Okay, so basically the idea is it is in there. It's not like listed exactly like that, but it's in there through all the issues around drought that have been raised in the document.
Yeah, there is not a one strategy that calls out drought specifically, because many of the strategies and actions have implications across different hazards. It was not called out, hazard by hazard.
Okay. Secretary Moore?
Yeah, I think I had flagged that, and part of the reason for raising it is I know that we've had several small community water systems that have had wells run dry as a result of drought patterns. And I don't know if Leslie Ann is able to join us today, but I've heard her speak previously about stationarity and sort of weather patterns that will set up and be maintained. And would love her input on whether the types of conditions that have sort of caused these wells to run dry, and communities, frankly, having to bring in bulk water, are likely to be more prevalent. I think our focus a lot of times tends to be on more extreme precipitation events, more heavy and intense precipitation events. But I think the other side of that may be equally impactful, particularly for a number of Vermont's smaller community water systems.
I see Leslie Ann has her hand up, so please go ahead.
Thanks a lot for that, Julie. So that is definitely part of the way that we're writing up the front section of the entire framing of the plan itself, and making sure that all aspects of hydrology, all aspects of all hazards are part of the conversation from the get-go. And getting some of those nuances that you were referring to about why do we need to talk about drought, and not just drought as a whole, but different types of drought and what that means for us going forward from a climate change perspective. So yes, thank you for raising that point. And it's definitely something that we're spending a lot of time making sure we're covering it well.
Great. That's wonderful. Chris?
Yeah, it's probably not. It just occurred to me, I don't think we can necessarily need to add it to this if we're another cap, but something I've wondered about, and some of our towns have asked about. During these years of drought, the flow of the Connecticut has gotten exceptionally low. And so one of the issues is competing demands for hydropower, but then also in the future, will there be needs to manage water withdrawals for, it's been raised to us, specifically irrigation. I don't know that we're necessarily going to have a lot of demand on that, but at times the flow has gotten so incredibly low, it could have an impact. So for the often forgotten east coast of Vermont, I'm just wondering if we might want to flag something specifically about the flows of the Connecticut River, because it's a challenging bi-state issue. Of course, we don't own a lot of it, but so we don't have to put it in this one. I don't mean to take up a lot of time about it, but just wanted to flag that.
Thanks, Chris. Okay. So Erica and Catherine, when you hear this, and knowing what Leslie Ann will put in the front around impacts, are there anything else you think needs to happen in the way these recommendations are framed on this issue?
I think what would be helpful would be if, because we heard this comment and then we looked at what we'd written and we did note where it was addressed. So I think if there were specific recommendations for how we might more clearly address drought and in the places that you would like it more clearly addressed, that would be appreciated rather than us trying to create edits to respond to what we think you're looking for.
Got it.
What do you
Okay.
think of that? Does that work, Erica?
Yeah.
And David, if I might, maybe it makes sense too, knowing that Leslie Ann and Jay are working on their component on the effects of climate change. It may be that this is just something to put a pin in and come back to once the draft of that section is available.
Okay, great. And it seems like there's also requests, Julie, in terms of if there's specific edits in these recommendations that would be helpful, that Catherine and Erica are open to those. Okay, great. Anything else on this issue of drought? And also Chris's point being noted, probably something for future work, but noted as well. Okay. Anything else on this issue? All right. Speaking of specific requests and comments, here was one specific comment on the toolkit and adding in specific mentions of high winds, heavy rain, hail, sleet, etc. Catherine, Erica, when you saw that, is that something that's like, oh yeah, easy, or there's some reason why you wouldn't do that?
I think it was in the intent. I think we just weren't as explicit in the actions as we could have been. It's really, the toolkit is a result of the vulnerability assessment, and having a toolkit that is informed by what our vulnerability assessment finds is going to be really important. And so it's going to be about what the risks are in every community. One of those risks is variable precipitation types in the wintertime that cause just as significant issues as flooding. So.
Okay, great. Anything else we need to say about this particular point? Okay, great. All right, so those were the ones that I'd marked in red. There are a number of additional ideas and suggestions, and we can dip into some of those. I also want to create a space if you didn't respond to the survey and you have something that feels truly mission critical for you, and when you went through these documents, and you want to put it out there because it really influences your ability to stand behind this as a counselor, this is an opportunity to bring those up as well. So I just put that out there because I'm working through a set of issues that were brought up by the counselors that responded to the survey. So I'm a little bit blind to those who didn't. All right, so feel free to jump in whenever. I'm going to grab a couple of these, and I'm not sure I'm going to do them particularly in order. I know that there was interest. Two of you had, oh wait, Sue has her hand up. Go ahead, Sue.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. David, I am not ready to raise something that gets in the way of my ability to support this, but I am wondering when is the appropriate time to raise sort of suggestions, I guess, smaller suggestions that might seem clarifications or improvements, but probably aren't worth taking up time in this forum. And I have a bunch of those that I just as soon share with the co-chairs if that's the appropriate thing to do.
Yeah. So those are absolutely welcome in the next like 24 hours. I think there's a need to turn around a new version of these documents or an updated version in the next week. And so that would be my answer, but I'll defer to the co-chairs too about sort of your timeline to receive any helpful suggestions.
We're nodding.
24 hours, okay.
We're going to be, we have some additional work that is going into section 12 to make it align a little bit more with the foundational criteria that we needed to assess. So there is some more work, although we need to turn that around in the next, I think it's in the next week, so that we have another, an updated draft to put forward to the council. So in the next day or two would be the best time frame to get any other.
Sorry.
That's very helpful. And I'll just follow up to say, I will then, I think we've talked about some issues, so I'm going to write some specific thoughts, and they're not many. The other sort of bigger universal question that I don't know is, certain program ideas are going to cost money, and I don't know if we're going to, in this iteration of the Climate Action Plan, talk about how much money we think is needed, what kind of revenue sources would we use, or do we, I'm just wondering, David, as a council, are we at a moment of saying there's a lot more detail to come? And so, new individual assistance programs, for example, are going to need resources, and where does that come from? So that's sort of a bigger picture question. Again, nothing is in the way of my wanting to support, but important questions, and the final one being prioritization of these many good ideas. Thanks.
Thanks, Sue. I know Jane's hand went right up on the issue of funding and how we're going to talk about that in the report, because there is a plan. And indeed, this is, we are not in a position as a council to put specific funding ideas on paper between now and December 1st. So Jane, feel free to provide additional clarity on that, but that's certainly the plan for now. There will be a overview of potential funding, but Jane, you can say a word more about that.
Thank you. Afternoon, everybody. So we talked about this with the steering committee at 2 meetings ago to ensure that there was support to frame up the funding conversation in a broad nature, and ensure that there was capacity and interest amongst the council to come back to the issue pretty quickly after December 1st, specifically around ARPA funding first and foremost, but then to dive deeper into funding and financing options for the climate action plan. You'll recall that we have done economic modeling for this first plan, but it was very much at a macro economy scale, and there will be a section that speaks specifically to the LEAP modeling and economic modeling up front in the climate action plan that Jared and Ken are helping summarize and take the lead on. And then there's a section in the implementation section that I drafted over the weekend with that guidance that will be posted as part of the suite of documents going up for your review for next week's meeting, that speaks specifically to the broad nature of the need for funding and financing, speaks then to the next steps around sort of moving from policy level conversations to program design and how that will factor in and consider funding as components of that, and then speaks to the next steps around economic modeling specifically needed for each policy lever that we're putting forward now that we've prioritized what those are. And then finally, a framework for how the council will consider the ARPA funding available for this coming year, and how we'll put that and realize that to specific actions in the climate action plan. So that will come next week, and then also be further work to come for the council after December.
Thanks, Jane. That's helpful. Chris?
Yeah, I'd be open to Catherine's take on this, but I would suggest timing the ARPA discussion around when the final Treasury rules are released, because right now there's still a lot of details that we're all waiting for. We've been advising towns to be patient and wait until we get that final guidance, because that'll also anyway, it may figure into what the best strategy is to take. So Catherine, you have a thought on that?
June gave her thumbs up and I echo that.
Okay. Noted. Thanks for bringing that up. Okay. Great. So circling back to the specific issues around the rural resilience subcommittee strategies, 2 folks brought up an issue that was related to the weatherization navigators suggestion. And I'm just dropping in the chat what my notes are, and that's a sort of hybrid piece of 2 people's comments on that. And the comments were more along the lines of, sounds interesting. Are we putting them in the right place, and or can they be expanded and be housed in other places as well? So those were 2 sets of comments that came in. And if you made those comments, feel free to elaborate on them. But I wonder, Catherine and Erica, when you saw those comments come in, what the reaction was, some immediate thoughts about how to address those comments.
I think, yeah, we saw those comments, and from an RPC perspective, as a director, I'll say I don't really care where these people are housed. The point of the RPCs was that it's locally embedded, accessible and available, and focused. The community action agencies has a certain type of clientele that they focus on traditionally. And VEIC our Efficiency Vermont has an approach that they focus on traditionally. And there does appear to be some hole in terms of focusing on community level and on the ground people available to help with this navigation. So I think where we landed in our discussion yesterday was yes, and yes, and yes. That if you look at the sheer volume of weatherization that has to happen to meet our goals, that one of those is not enough.
Okay. So specific recommendation that could be amended to reflect that it could be in multiple places and the need will be great. Okay. Joey?
Yes, and yes, and yes. I like that. As the person who raised that, I wouldn't say it as a concern. I would just say I agree with that assessment, Catherine. I think there is a niche and a need for investment in RPCs playing a role in this transition. But the question was more like, yeah, it seems like there may be a greater need in other potential community partner organizations, and how they complement and are coordinated is a bigger question. And this is something we have certainly identified in the transportation conversations and moved it into the cross-cutting conversation about the need to invest in critical capacity. So this would certainly fit there. So I appreciate your response, and I generally share that sentiment in the response. One, oh God, I just thought that one of the questions I had for you was, oh, hang on, I'm gonna have to come back to it.
It'll come back.
I think, in the end, I think it would be very easy to reword this action to reflect both the need for increased capacity in those places that already exist and increase in the number of doors through which individuals and entities can enter to get this help.
Nice. That's great. Joey, just when you're ready to go back, just raise your hand. Come right back to you. Rich, go ahead.
I like what Catherine just had to say about increased capacity and increasing the number of doors. I mean, I'm sure that the text can be written to say that. I would also add that the kind of navigation assistance that Vermonters are going to need includes not just weatherization, but heating system improvements generally. So I would urge you to expand the language a little bit to go beyond the narrow term weatherization.
So more like a whole systems approach.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, we have a parallel, policy on trying to reduce emissions from burning fossil fuels for heat in the first place. So these things go hand in hand.
And certainly that was the way the conversation happened the other day in cross-sector, was wanting to marry these ideas of weatherization and heating system changes. Yeah.
Yeah. And the navigator ought to be able to help people consider both at the same time.
Great. Okay, great. Sue, go ahead, please.
Thank you for this conversation. And I would just reinforce yes, and yes, and yes. There are different doors through which people are comfortable and able to cross in terms of those navigating skills. But I would also, let's just add to what you said, Catherine, that I liked perfectly well, that there needs to be coordination among and between those navigators as well, so that we're having consistent sort of curricula being developed so that we're all on the right page together. Thanks.
Thanks, Sue.
You can't see me nodding my head as you're on the phone.
And Stu, it's Chris. I just plugged that into the chat. Just you were saying it.
There it is. Right. It's right in there. Joey, you got it back.
That was my point. That was what I was going to say. I'm so sorry. Thank you, Rich, I just dropped it in the chat. It was just a question about, is it only related to weatherization, or could it be the whole home, trying to make it as efficient for people to do as much as possible across the sort of sectoral space. So
great. I note that Abby,
to that, and thank you for filling my riddled brain, Rich and others.
I note that Abby made a similar point in the chat as well. So it seems like there's a lot of interest in that. Okay, great. Anything else on these navigators we want to say? It feels like the instruction's fairly clear about how to reformulate that a little bit. Okay, Great. So let's just tick through a couple more of these. This is not in any particular order, so feel free to force this order by jumping out and making your point if you have something strong you want to say. Here's another piece in Pathway 1, Strategy 3 about advancing equitable resilience. It doesn't feel like the actions actually do that, was the comment. I don't know, Catherine and Erica, when you saw that, if you saw that one, if there was a reaction you had to that about how to think about that reaction.
Yeah, I think we just needed to revisit that one, and it was a combination of a couple of different strategies and actions that came together. It is important to note that this strategy relates to, and I'm trying to pull it back up here. It does come back to part of our statutory charge, and I don't have that particular strategy right up in front of me right now, so I can't.
I can pull it up in just a sec. Yeah.
Well, I'm getting to it. Hold on.
This is, I have in the short version here, if this is helpful, Erica. I think this is it here, Strategy 3 under Pathway 1.
Right. So this was a little bit, it's within the capacity building pathway. And we did note that there's a lot of understanding, meaning a lot of research and assessment that still needs to be done to understand where some of the gaps are. And so when we look at this strategy about expanding cross-sector collaboration to align efforts, share best practices, and leverage resources to advance equitable resilience, it is making sure that whatever is advanced, any of the programs that that come out of this are done and advanced in an equitable way. The actions were not necessarily meant to draw upon that. It was more about the assessment piece, but we probably need to just refine that a little bit more.
Okay. All right. Abby, go ahead, please.
I just wanted to share, and apologies because it didn't, time being the always problem. This isn't reflected adequately in our drafts at the moment, but it is my intention to go through, and anywhere that we sort of haven't had the time or capacity to do the thorough equity vetting, that I was going to write in something regarding, we had talked about this at the subcommittee level of, kind of any new implementation or reworking of these systems should be vetted through the guiding principles. And I wonder if this might be a place where you could do that too. I just had the thought that maybe if since we adopted the guiding principles and I think are trying to frame things in that manner, if that's consistently throughout the plan where we weren't able to address equity in those in as much depth as we would like to, maybe that's a way to sort of help ground whoever becomes the implementer in the way that they would move forward to implement things equitably. If that's not helpful, don't worry about it. That's just a thought we've had.
No, that was something that came out loud and clear with the subcommittee, and we actually added a significant portion to point out that we didn't have the time to adequately go through and understand all of the equity impacts of these actions, and we wanted to be really forthright and clear about that in the writing of this section. So we were very clear about that in here. But I think it's a necessary piece because we don't want to give people the impression that these had been thought through in that way.
Thanks, Erica. Chris?
Yeah, just to agree, and also just to note that we're working on some tables right now that you guys have not seen, and there is a discussion in the framing that addresses, I believe, this concern regarding kind of equitable program design and implementation. So stay tuned.
Nice. Okay, great. Okay, Let me drop my screen. Or Lauren, do you want, let me know if it's helpful to have the screen up or down. Yeah.
It's helpful just because I noticed something that I didn't catch before. The second bullet under strategy 3, I really like the idea of funding a climate change impact assessment for Vermont's commercial sector. I just wonder if we should broaden it beyond ski and sugaring and maybe just say recreation industries as well as the food products industry. So we're not just focusing in on those two, because I think that assessment could be really helpful for individual industries to understand how they can plan for the future.
Yeah, the only reason that those two industries were called out, and it's kind of a commercial sector, including the ski and sugaring industry, is because in the rural resilience and adaptation area of the GWSA, it specifically calls out those industries. So we wanted to make sure that they're addressed. But yeah, I think you're right on there.
Okay. So I wonder if there's a way to do both, where you broaden it out to say recreation and food products, such as ski and sugaring, right? So you're able to do both things. Okay. All right. I am happy to move on unless anybody wants to keep discussing the issue about that particular strategy. There's a few more here that we can work our way through. Some of these I'm going to need a little help on because I wasn't entirely clear where they were. This is one around communication action agencies. And someone says, I would like to recommend that the community action agencies be identified as entities that the state can quickly seek to resource to address the most frontline and marginalized communities and residents with services. So I don't know exactly where in the document that is. But
we didn't see that comment. I don't think we saw that comment yesterday, so it must have come in a little bit later. I would just be interested to see if this is an overarching comment or if this is in response to a particular pathway or strategy.
So Sue, was that yours?
I guess it was. I think it's really specific, and I will validate with more specific comments. It's about individual assistance post-disaster for the marginalized communities that are often, the last to be addressed as opposed to the first. I'll get more details to you.
Thanks, Sue. That's good. I think we can add that detail in there.
Great. Yeah, is that connected to the email you sent to us as well, Sue?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Chris?
So if I can just offer a friendly amendment, and I'm happy to help if you want it, but you probably know this too. In addition to the community action agencies, can I just suggest that community action networks, because I know like they're in the wake of Irene and other events, and then the pandemic and all, we've got, our like mutual aid networks and co-ads and other things like that. So so SEVCA, our community action agency, is part of that, but so is Groundworks Collaborative, and then our local and regional Department of Health and Agency of Human Services folk, and food banks and everybody else. So just didn't know if you might be open to a friendly amendment there.
Yeah, Chris, just like regional planning commissions are sort of multi-sectoral and partnership oriented, that's also the point of the community action agencies. So we can call it community action networks. We can change the name. The point is that there be some pre-positioning, because what happened after Irene, and well, that came later instead of at the outset. And I think that the state would be well advised to be thinking, and it's certainly part of the equity conversation, to have a plan to actually address those folks who won't be able to resource themselves, to have that longer term action starting early on, instead of after everybody who can take care of their own needs, we finally get to the folks who are truly alone and suffering. So thank you.
Amen.
Yeah, we can definitely expand that network concept.
Amen.
Excellent. Okay, great. And just before I move on, Catherine and Erica, is clear about where and how to put that in the doc? Yeah. Okay.
I think yeah, we'll work with Sue on that.
Great. Okay. Here's another one. There was a question, again, sort of where's the clear link between increasing efforts and funding towards pollution prevention programs at wastewater facilities in climate change? There wasn't a suggestion of what to do about it. It was just sort of like a moment. So I don't know, Erica or Catherine, if there's some greater explanation that is helpful there, or maybe right now in the council about why this is important and part of this package.
Yeah, I think so. Those are part of the package, the water resource package that fell under the infrastructure pathway. And, so we worked pretty closely with DEC on developing those. I think the overarching sentiment is that, if we have, especially drinking water sources and pollutants in our waterways, then it cuts down the resilience of the community to have access to really a lifeline. And so I think that's in terms of overall resilience, maybe not necessarily specific to climate change, although one could argue that, with flooding events, we see a lot more intrusion in water treatment facilities that causes issues. It's an overarching comment about pollution and the impact on community resilience.
Okay, great. Secretary Moore?
Yeah, I think that was my comment, and in some ways I agree. Pollution prevention programs are an important piece of support that the agency provides to municipal wastewater facilities. I just struggle to see this as a priority related to resilience or climate action, and was trying to flag a handful of places where I feel like we sort of, our universe of recommendations gets bigger and bigger, and I think it could have the unintended consequence of diluting some of the more impactful recommendations that are really more narrowly targeted to climate action. And just this was one that jumped out at me, that I there are lots of reasons to have pollution prevention programs, but trying to carry it through to being a climate action feels like a stretch.
Okay. Thanks, Julie.
I
Abby?
think the other, sorry.
Sorry, but Abby, do you want to work on that, or you just got something else?
Catherine can respond, that's fine.
Okay, great.
The edit that we got back on this one to address that question was making the point that without expansion and capacity to do the pollution prevention, these facilities won't be able to support the additional demand from the compact settlement increases that we're calling for as part of the climate plan. So that's the connection that we got. That was the clarification that we got in terms of that particular action.
Nice.
Secretary Moore, something that you said though underscores a challenge that we've had all along, which is when you think about climate adaptation and resilience, the scope is enormous. And when we compare that to GHG reduction emissions, the number of solutions that can be applied to that problem is relatively finite. It's pretty clear. Whereas when we talk about resilience and adaptation, even the definitions are not, there isn't a common definition that everybody uses for resilience. So even defining the what that we're trying to measure and resolve is difficult. So when we were applying, trying to prioritize actions and strategies around resilience and adaptation, there are so many avenues that really are interconnected. And it's something that we struggled with, because we really want to be able to show the return on investment be to measure the outcomes against an overall standard definition of resilience. And it's a moving target. And so, I think that's why you have so many actions and strategies related to resilience and adaptation. It's directly because of that, because of the broad scope of the issue.
Thanks, Erica. Yeah. Abby?
Yeah, and so two things to follow up on Erica, I would say, and Lauren's comment in the chat. I live in a community where both wastewater treatment facilities are, one on the reservoir that creates hydropower, and the other is right in a brook, right on a brook. And so if that infrastructure isn't hardened, particularly in this community, which was hit so hard by Irene and other flooding events, as Southern Vermont is likely to have even more of, also in the fact that our town currently can't afford to even fix that infrastructure. And so I think, again, that just, Erica, I couldn't have said it better. I just think there are a lot of these things that I hear pushback on. This isn't regarding climate. Climate is our resilience and our ability to adapt to climate change is going to tap into every single one of our systems at a certain point. And so I think that is going to be the challenge is, funding, I'm sure, is going to be very complicated in that regard because of the way that we have things siloed out or designed at the moment. But I think we're going to have to be creative at a certain point and understand that, this conversation came up in our subcommittee as well. Why are we talking about wastewater infrastructure, or why are we, water is everything. So, it seems relevant in that regard. The other thing for rural resilience, I'm thinking this would be something to think about for maybe the next iteration of the climate action plan, because again, time, but just wondering if you did think at all about sort of social infrastructure things or workforce development, or whether that can maybe come later, but just thinking about, again, for those of us living rurally, how do you live life rurally and what do you need to, be resilient and adapt? And it seems like this is a little bit more hard infrastructure based, and just wondering if the next iteration, maybe we could tackle some more of those softer infrastructure components of how to be resilient and adaptive rurally. Thanks.
Thanks, Abby. Okay.
We definitely identified that social infrastructure piece as something that we need to think about is crucial to resilience. And in the editing of our actions and the compilation of the final result, we realized people kind of got left out, even though it's front in our minds. So we may tweak the words here and there to make sure that that's noted more strongly. And then the workforce got pulled out. We did have some actions related to that. It got pulled out to include in the cross-cutting issue.
Okay, great. All right, so there is one other comment related to wastewater treatment facilities, and that is around adding an action about relocating wastewater treatment facilities away from rivers, lakes. And this speaks to Abby's hometown problem. So I don't know if this is something that needs a specific call out, but it came in from someone in the comments.
You want to take this one, Erica, or you want me to?
I mean, we talked about this yesterday too, which was, a lot of it goes along with there isn't a one size fits all solution. A lot of wastewater infrastructure and water supply is in a place where it really can't be moved. And so you need to do some strategic investment to harden it and maybe relocate it in areas where you can relocate it. So it's not going to be a simple solution for every single community.
Okay.
And as part of the toolkit and the assessment of vulnerability and the evaluation of what should happen for our critical infrastructure, that would always be one of the things that's considered, but we can't go into it assuming that that's the right answer for any of them, although it could be the right answer for some of them.
Got it. I see Michael has his hand up. Michael, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, just to add to this one, I just went back and read our pathway on it again, and it's not in there, but I remember conversations about during the extreme precipitation events that we did have release of pollutants into the water, and I thought that's what we had the conversations about. I know that's not in the pathway, but that's something to think about as well, because we see it all the time around Vermont with the extreme precipitation events where the wastewater plants are releasing raw sewage into the waterways. So something to keep in mind there.
Not necessarily called out specifically in pathway 2, which is the infrastructure pathway, but there is more in pathway 4, which looks at doing climate readiness assessments for drinking water, stormwater, and wastewater infrastructure, as well as increasing investment in that infrastructure to protect public health and water quality. So it's definitely in there. Again, it's one of those things that it can fall under multiple pathways. It's just kind of more based on the structure of how we needed to develop the plan.
Okay. In terms of a specific change that you would make to the document based on this comment and this feedback, are there specific things you'd want to do, Catherine and Erica, to take this in? Is there any nuance that needs to be offered in these pathways so people can see that this, as you said, Catherine, it may be, but it isn't necessarily the right approach?
I don't have a specific suggestion at this moment in time.
Okay.
Short of noting that it's a comment, and as we go through edits, if we can find a place to make note. I think there's something in general infrastructure assessment that includes strategic abandonment, and maybe we can make sure it has location as relocating as well, as something that's considered.
Great. Okay. And all right. So I'm seeing some comments as well from Judy from the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee about this, encouraging you to take a look at it. So I think from a council standpoint, are counselors okay if Catherine and Erica look through and see if there's a way to strengthen language on this issue? Is that a sufficient resolution to this problem here? Or this comment, excuse me, it's not a problem, but this comment, is that sufficient? Any concerns about that? So let me open this up in the last couple minutes we have before we can take a break, to say, are there other things that you would like, or you would more than like, are there other things that you would absolutely want to see changed in these documents that we haven't addressed so far? Like, are there things that are just really frustrating for you when you look at it and you really want to see them changed? Okay, great. Well, that's great. All right, so Catherine and Erica, thank you for being in the hot seat this whole time and taking all these comments and observations. We have some very clear next steps on those points, and wonderful. Why don't we give ourselves a little bit longer break? We'll come back at 3:20 and dive into the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee recommendations. Really appreciate here all the heavy lifting for everybody. The subcommittees who are doing all this writing, everybody else who's able to read it. And so thanks everyone. Let's take a break. We'll see you back here at 3:20 and we'll dive into the Ag and Ecosystem work. All right. Take care, everybody. We'll see you in a sec. Let's pick it back up. Thanks, folks. Now, just as we're getting going, I had a note from Lauren that she had a quick something to say or an announcement that's worth doing right now. And so before we dive into Ag and Ecosystem, Lauren, let me turn it over to you to do that.
Oh, an announcement's a bit large. No, just a moment of acknowledgement. Earlier this morning, there was a press release for the 2021 Vermont Climate Assessment Report. And in that press release, I was reminded of something that I think warrants public acknowledgement here. I think Catherine and Chris both noted it in the chat last time, but the chat's always so busy and the chat isn't recorded on YouTube. So for people watching this on YouTube in the future, just want to note that one of our counselors among us, Dr. Depini Giroux, was asked to speak at the UN COP26 in Glasgow, which is just so incredible. And I don't think we really acknowledged how impressive it is that one of the 23 of us was asked to speak at such a large climate conference. And it's just a real moment of joy and pride, I think, for all of us to kind of share in.
Bravo. Fantastic.
And I hope she's here to hear that. I know she hates that, but.
Stop, Lauren, but thank you.
Wonderful. Okay. All right. So why don't we keep moving forward here? And for ag and ecosystem, there's 3 different components to this. And before we get into those 3 components, as we did at the top of the meeting, I want to give co-chairs the opportunity to just frame up these conversations. I have a similar punch list of issues that came out of the survey, and I've highlighted some as needing more attention than others, likely among full group conversation. So we can work our way through that. But before we do that, I'll just turn it over to your co-chairs here if you want to frame up this conversation and how we want to walk through these issues and anything else you'd like to say to the council before we get going. So Abby and Billy, I'll turn it over to you.
Billy, you want to kick it off or you want me to?
After you, Abby.
Okay, here we go. Similar to Erica and Catherine, want to invite the members of our subcommittee who are here to turn on their cameras if they would like, and please feel free to help us help bolster the responses to questions that come up. John is shaking his head, but he turned his camera on. Mm-hmm. And I think Ryan Patch is here to help us with some of the more specific ag mitigation pieces, et cetera, et cetera. And I know Judy Dow was hoping to stay, but she has a class to teach, so she won't be able to join us for this conversation at the moment, but has been critical to our work here. So, Billy, want to add anything, or should we just jump in?
Thanks everyone for your written comments. I think many of which we can hopefully explain and reconcile today, and others, we'll get some more specific guidance from y'all and work on them this week. So really appreciate the time folks took to read what I know is a lot of material.
Thanks, Billy. Thanks, Abby. Okay. Billy and Abby, do you have any preference in the order how we handle this in the 3 buckets, the sequestration, the adaptation, and the mitigation pieces? Is there any preference you have? No? Okay. All right. Let's start then just in the order that they were in the survey, for lack of a better order. And again, I have pieces that I've highlighted in red from the survey pieces, and then other pieces that felt more like suggestions. So I think because of the amount of material, my recommendation is let's stick with the reds and then do a shout out to see if anybody else has anything else that is urgent, and then we'll move on to the next section and do the reds on those. And we also have tomorrow morning to do pieces that we don't get to. So the first piece here on my screen is around the sequestration and storing of carbon recommendations coming out of the subcommittee. This looks like more red. It's just a lot. This one is a long, I cut and paste a lot of text into this. So it's really just 3 issues here. The first one is around biomass plants. And while this is a sensitive issue, I think it's very interesting for us to dig into it a little bit as a full council and understand what's been going on at the subcommittee on this, and be able to react on that. This specific comment is around the mention of quote, prohibiting expansion on existing biomass plants. And there's some very specific comments here. And again, this is from Liz, so I'll ask Liz to help out when it's time. About, it's actually, we're talking about 2 sort of commercial sized plants here. And then there's some specific things about what expansion might mean, because one of those plants might be looking to do district heating. And so there's a request to think about the language on that and what that really means. Okay. And then separately, another one of you suggested, let's be clear in our language around large scale or industrial scale and make some definitions there. Okay, so that's one piece about the prohibiting expansion of existing biomass plants and some concerns there. The other 2 pieces, one at the bottom here is related, where it felt like there was being a ban on biomass for thermal heat, and that would have significant implications. Requires some discussion at the council level to understand what's going on in the subcommittee and what's happening there. And that this person said the entire narrative around biomass for thermal heat is concerning about the way it's being framed up. The third piece here in the middle is there were some questions about recommendations to changes to the renewable energy standard, one on forest products and one on planting trees. And again, wanting some greater clarity on that. Wanted to understand, I believe that's Liz, you as well. Okay, so those are the 3 that sort of emerged at the top. There's a couple of other ones down here that we can get to, but I would suggest we do the reds first and then see if we want to do anything else before moving on to the next bucket of issues. So let's take this first one on the prohibiting expansion. And I don't know whether we want to have a similar piece where Liz on this, if you want to say with any more detail about what this, what the concern is and what a pathway might be. And then Billy and Abby, if you've had a chance, or others who are working on this one to react.
Can we frame up this issue broadly and at first, David, and then let folks respond? Okay, thank you.
Why don't I stop sharing to let you do that, and then I'll throw that back up whenever you need me to share.
Sure. So I think the issue of biomass, specifically wood fuel, is one that has been discussed at length in our subcommittee and has been probably the if not one of if not the most difficult issue for us to manage. If you looked at the narrative section of the draft report, there was actually a disclaimer in there stating that the subcommittee had yet to reach a resolution on this issue, lacked certain pieces of information to make a final decision, but was including it to get feedback from the council. So I think you can take that to understand that this is not kind of a final baked piece, but it does reflect a lot of the conversation that we have had. I think we have struggled to some extent teasing out issues related to large scale electric led biomass versus small scale thermal and district, the small scale residential and thermal applications. I think we've made some progress on that, but based on your comments and my own personal feelings, I think we've got more progress to make there. So I'll let Abby really kind of go into the details of the recommendations and respond to some of the specific comments. But I guess I would just close in saying we're very open to getting feedback from the council on how you would like us to reconcile this issue, because it's still an open one at Agony Ghosts.
Thanks, Billy.
I don't know that I'm going to be the person that tries to tackle these answers one-on-one. That's probably, this is not, for the record, my area of expertise. But what I do want to also frame us in very carefully with this is what I think has come up in our subcommittee in this regard are the issues, the discussions, the tensions that arise when you're attempting to frame out a just transition in the context of environmental justice. And that requires really hard conversations. It requires a lot of nuance. It requires time. And it's complicated, right? There are no decisions that we're going to make moving forward in the face of a changing climate that don't have an impact somewhere. So we've talked a lot, and Kaya has assisted us with this, you know, at the very least, we have to be transparent. And so what we're attempting to do navigating this discussion is to be
is to start to elevate and illustrate some of these issues that are going to come up as we think about how we move these programs, et cetera, forward. And I think that that's what's starting to come up with biomass, particularly. There are the realities as we've come to understand it or been educated in our subcommittee that, you know, some of the plants do currently exist on archaeological sites of relevance to Indigenous communities. You know, and in the scope of environmental justice, those are really critical issues that have to be considered when we're thinking about the impact that we're having with our renewable energy siting, et cetera. So I think that's a lot of what's going on here. And as Billy said, this is an active grappling that we're going through at the moment. So with that, maybe we'll open up to talk a little more, have a little bit more open discussion about what the comments that we received.
That's great. Okay. Why don't we take them as sort of discrete comments and then figure out how we're going to make progress on them. You know, there's this specific issue around the, and I can pull it up on the screen, the actual recommendation that talks about prohibiting expansion of existing commercial scale or industrial scale biomass plants. And I know, Liz, I'll go to your hand in just a second, Rich, but Liz, you had raised up some very specific concerns about that and its implications, and also had suggested some more nuanced phrasing of that. Do you want to lay that out there and then see how that fits in with this bigger conversation?
I'm feeling triggered, David, by the red used with my comments in the last subcommittee in this one.
I should have used green. I'm sorry.
Yeah, exactly. Because it was meant in both cases to be hopefully productive and actually short in that I tried to include, where possible, suggestions. I think it gets to the overarching issue of, as we vote for recommendations, what are we voting for and how can we frame them to be in a way that is both what we intend and drives toward the greatest consensus. So I was just flagging for this subcommittee that in the event there were no language changes and this were put in front of us, I would not be in a position to support it as a representative appointed for the utility sector in light of McNeil, which is a jointly owned facility. And I just wanted to make sure the subcommittee was aware of that concern and had some paths they could consider to change the recommendation. So I don't think I need to add more there, as long as they are aware of the potential for district heating and the implications, you know, the positive implications that could bring. I understand Abby's comments and the subcommittee's grappling with the issue generally, and don't intend to, you know, sort of block any recommendation on electric-led biomass at all. I was instead looking for ways to make this particular recommendation a little bit more nuanced and allow for some possibilities with the jointly owned facility that might be important to preserve.
Thanks, Liz. Okay. So are there any questions about that, what we're talking about right now? And that specific suggested modification to a recommendation? Are there any comments or reactions? And Rich, I'm happy to grab your hand if it's about this. If not, I'll come back to you in a sec.
I just want to voice my concurrence with what Liz said.
Okay. Thanks, June. That's great. And Rich, is your hand about this issue?
Well, I would like to comment on this issue and then also on biomass generally.
Okay.
But on this issue, if there are siting issues specific to Reigate, I think we should distinguish a siting issue from the generic issue of the use of biomass for electricity. And this would pertain both to Reigate and to McNeil. Vermont has a significant forest products industry. We have a significant portion of our landmass, which is privately owned forests in active management. And a lot of Vermonters are employed in the woods, managing forests. One of the uses of waste forest products is is to ship them to Reigate or ship them to McNeil. So I guess I would be with Liz. I would be reluctant to endorse a blanket policy here that seemed to be hostile to that particular aspect of forest products industries in Vermont.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. And we have discussed that these plants provide an important market for certain forest landowners interested in selling products from their land. That goal and that helps keep forests, which is kind of critical to our long-term strategies around storage, sequestration, etc. There's members of our subcommittee who may recognize that, but see these other concerns as equally important or more so. So I think that's the predicament that we found ourselves in. So guidance from you all is appreciated.
So, but Billy, if the issue is citing, then I think we can talk about that separately.
It is not just citing.
Okay. So if the issue is,
Citing
I'm happy to hear it. If the issue is using trees for electricity or using trees for heat or what?
The issue is the citing of, and in this case, it's the citing of McNeil, as I understand it. And it's the issue of potential lack of oversight in terms of how much waste to imported lumber is being used to power the plants, the amount of tree cutting that's happening to have that happen, et cetera, et cetera. Like I said, this is very complex and very nuanced and we need to handle this well. And, it's kind of a little frightening to me that we're just starting to have this conversation at the full council level in this moment, because it's so complex and it impacts so many different people in so many ways that I think we commonly don't think about when we're just thinking about renewable energy. And that's the issue that I think so much of what happened in our subcommittee is that the breadth of trying to think about 94% of Vermont's land base means you're running into all of the different complexities as you bump up against what this means to each different constituency. And I include in that land, animals, trees, rocks, etc. That was part of it has been part of our work here as well. So I think what I'm going to say is, if folks have suggestions regarding language and or what they could or could not accept to move forward, it would be really helpful to the subcommittee to have that in writing from people. I think that could help guide our discussions as a subcommittee a little bit better, to have in writing sort of, because that's been a tension point that, we can talk about this in Ag and Eco, it's got to go to the Climate Council, they have to sign off on it. And so I think some very clear thinking and guidance from all of you as to some of the other nuances of this would be, is critical.
Thanks, Ivy. I see some more hands, and then let's see what really, quote unquote, the council is trying to say here. Joey?
I appreciate the complexity of what you guys are grappling with and acknowledge it. I think I share some of the concerns that Liz may have raised, but I also get that it's very complex. I have a couple of questions. One being, a thermal lead facility is very different than an electric lead facility only. I'm wondering if there is, and I apologize, I totally missed this segment of your important suite of recommendations and my input, but is there a distinction between prohibiting the new establishment of electric lead facilities? That seems like a very different thing. And that actually harkens to my question of process, how you guys are coordinating with the comprehensive energy plan and how that has grappled with biomass, and how the recommendations of the comprehensive energy plan might be reflected in your recommendations at this moment. Because I think I know that there's some principles in the CEP related to thermal lead applications that may be helpful to bring in here, and related to sustainable harvest and other things that would be really critical considerations. And so again, just appreciating that you're grappling with it. I recognize how complex it is, but I think that there may be sort of a stepped approach to highlight what we shouldn't do. And if we do continue to move forward with a couple of the plants that do exist, how we might maximize their efficiency. And
yeah, thanks, Joey. I think, you know, just to kind of jump in and try to be responsive, I think there's a clear proposed provision against the expansion or any new large-scale electric lead facilities. So I don't read that as a prohibition against kind of thermal lead plants. I think there's some question that Liz raised in this language about for existing plants, if they do want to expand to incorporate a thermal loop or some form of district heat, whether this gets in the way of that. And then there are additional provisions in here that you know, may make thermal lead applications of wood heat more difficult and need to comply with a number of criteria.
Okay, thanks, Billy, for that. Chris?
David, can you go back to the comments?
Yeah.
Again.
I also have the actual proposals handy if folks want to look at those too.
Just so scroll down to the section below. So are we at the ban on biomass for thermal heat? Are we talking about all these right now, or are we talking about only the first?
We're kind of talking about all of them with using the first as an example, but this is absolutely worth talking about and seeing if that's really what's going on or not in the standards.
And I just want to be clear, I don't see that in our recommendations anywhere.
I didn't see it either. That's why I was asking about it.
Right.
Okay, because my issue is we've been implementing modern wood heat systems in large institutions like schools, and they're using primarily wet chips. This is funded through the Clean Energy Development Fund. And we also supported the development of cogeneration electric and thermal at like Allard Lumber using their waste wood, which seems to me to be completely appropriate. But I didn't see the ban on biomass for thermal heat either. I would have to raise concerns about that. And, you know, out of what percentage of Vermonters heat with wood? I know we're trying to get that more efficient and but okay, so as long as that's not in there, I don't have quite the red flag that I don't know, I just thought that I was missing something huge there, because part of the whole point of the Clean Energy Development Fund work down here was to create a distribution network for pellet and chip suppliers, you know, preferably using local wood, because we have the largest hardwood forestry sector down here in our corner of the state.
Yeah, right. And I guess I'll just, to be very clear, there are some recommendations in here that look for additional research to confirm the kind of the net carbon impacts of wood heat and other impacts associated with harvesting that may affect the use of wood heat in modern, in those sorts of applications. So I would encourage you all to look closely at that language as well.
I think that's great. That's great.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is well, let me go to Julie. Go ahead, Secretary Moore.
Sure, I think I'm one of the people who flagged this. The heading for that item has no sense of scale, right? Like if you get into some of the sub recommendations, it talks about large scale, industrial scale. The heading is address biomass for thermal heat. And that was what raised the flag for me. I don't think that and concerned just that the sideboards from some of the sub recommendations I think need to be carried up and reflected in that heading for that to move forward.
Great. So the heading is giving a broader sense than what the content is below. Okay, great. And we've also, you all as a council made some specific mentions of the fact that thermal systems or cogeneration systems seem like something that are worth exploring. And in fact, Vermont actively is working on that at the same time as research that tries to really understand the carbon footprint of these types of systems. That's kind of what I'm hearing from you all as counselors. Rich? Hang on one second.
I think that's a good summary. And I guess I would only add research to consider the life cycle impacts of the use of biomass in the context of the actively managed forests of Vermont. In other words, it isn't just the life cycle impact of a single harvested tree, it's the life cycle impacts of the use of biomass in the context of managed timberland that is also supporting a forest products industry. So it's a little, that's a nuance, but it helps us to focus on the forest and not the tree.
Great.
Okay. I agree, Rich. So I appreciate you saying that, and we'll try to bring that back to our report.
That's great. Lauren?
Yeah, as we take into account the comments that we're receiving, which are really helpful, and appreciate Abby asking if there's anything that you can recommend in writing to bring back to the subcommittee, because this has taken up a lot of space in our subcommittee in the last, month maybe. I just wonder when we also incorporate those comments, and I'm sorry if I've missed this, and this might be a question for David Farnsworth, who's leading the weatherization thermal sector for cross-sector. Did cross-sector not cover biomass, or do you have biomass specific actions or strategies that we should be coordinating with?
We have biomass heat in the weatherization and buildings, as a supported fuel switch.
Yeah, I can chime in on that. Under the clean heat standard, advanced wood heat would qualify where it's replacing fossil heat. But we have agreed all along with the thrust of this conversation that it's only credited on a net life cycle basis.
Right. And that work needs to be done, right? That work needs to be done in terms of determining that. And that was what we spoke about 2 weeks ago, or a week ago in this conversation.
Well, yeah, some of the biomass fuels, encompass a lot more than wood. So all of those biomass fuels, whether it's, a biodiesel that comes from some other feedstock, or whether it's pellets used in a pellet stove in Vermont, our recommendation is that the clean heat standard give credit for that only to the extent that they avoid fossil fuels, only to the degree that they avoid emissions on a life cycle basis.
Right.
I may make a suggestion as well, because I think some of what is coming up here is, again, to a certain extent, what I've tried to bring up in concerns is that these are the conversations that are going to happen. These are the questions that are going to come up from the public as this work gets brought to broader and broader levels. There are going to be these, very complicated discussions that come up. And so I think to a certain extent, it could be helpful too. Our subcommittee meets on Fridays from 9 to noon, and maybe it would be helpful for a few counselors, particularly from cross sector, to come and attend and, try to understand a little bit better with what we're grappling and to engage in that conversation in that way. I think, I just think maybe that would be helpful.
Great. That's an offer. And take Abby up and Billy up on that. Okay, so on the issue of biomass, it feels like where we're landing, I tried to make that summary of the headline should reflect more clearly what's down below and feel a little bit less broad. There is interest in being very clear about thermal systems and cogeneration systems of being something that is worth supporting now, or at least certainly not worth lumping into the electric only generation systems. And that the research does need to happen, and Rich provided some nuanced language around that research. I think also from Liz's initial comment about the expansion phrase, Liz had a very specific suggestion about you're being comfortable, Liz, about, no expansion. You use the word nameplate capacity for electricity production. That seems okay to sort of say, we don't want more of that necessarily. However, there may be through, whether it's district heating or something else, things that happen at these plants that would be net positives that would alter these plants.
Yeah, I don't think I need to expand more. I mean, I gave 2 specific ways we could go. On the nameplate one, it would depend upon the language bluntly. But the easiest thing to do would be to strike the existing and to honor Abby's point on the siting issues for plants that already exist with some textual reference. But there might be other ways to do it. So that's why hopefully the specific suggestions I gave to Abby and others will be helpful, and I'd be happy to talk with them more about it.
Great. Okay. Are there other things we want to say about biomass right now in these issues? Anything else we want to provide for feedback? Or someone wants to correct my summary, which unfortunately is just verbal. I don't have it well written down. Kaya, you want to go ahead?
I appreciate you. Sorry, got a kid trying to teach him how to fold laundry at the same time. This is, so when we're talking about biomass, and I apologize if this has already been kind of brought out, both in this meeting and in the previous meetings around biomass, and Abby's, Jamal, can you please stop complaining? Thank you. So about the overall need for greater support around finding our way through biomass, recognizing both the kind of time sensitivity that committee has been up against, and also recognizing and honoring that they've been some really, really, truly difficult conversations, some of the most complicated of any of the committees here, have really had to wrestle with what it means to have equity and having to really wrestle with how we think about this. And so recognizing that wood heat is a means for it's a means for creating energy. However, there are impacts both to people living in the immediate area of those facilities that are creating things like wood pellets and such, as well as larger impacts that some of which we don't completely have all the information we need yet. So I want to ask that you tread carefully. If you choose to come into those spaces, be very thoughtful about whether or not you come with too much of an expertise hat and not enough of a listening, and especially around the equity nuances that have been lost. But what Abby also said around the fact that these are the questions that people are asking, they're already showing up in the press. And so much of what I keep saying about this equity work is it's getting you ready for the pop quiz. So these are the questions that people are going to hold. And some of those same critiques are already coming up in letters to the editors and editorials that we're seeing, opinion pieces and things that are showing up right now. So that is something that will just need to be grappled with, but probably won't be ready by December 1st. So I just wanted to say that that they do need support, but please come in with listening ears. Thank you.
Thank Kaya. Glad you said that. Okay, should we go on to that other piece that was I had flagged now in color green in the top, and it's about the renewable energy standard. And again, this was a request to understand this better, that there were some mentions of this both in forest products and one in planting trees. And so I don't know, Billy or Abby, if you look at this.
I can speak to this quickly. I think at least one of these, the one that speaks about the renewable energy standard supporting expanded tree planting, I think that was an aspirational concept tied to tier 3 of the renewable energy standard, which creates an obligation for the distribution utilities to support fossil fuel conversion. Bluntly put, they're helping their customers install heat pumps, purchase electric vehicles, etc. And there is a hope that that model could be extended to tree planting, given trees' ability to store and sequester carbon. Understanding that that would require a change to the law, potentially, etc. So I think that's what that is. It's not particularly well baked. I think it was just a concept that resonated amongst the consensus of our members. So we didn't take it much further than that. So I appreciate there's some complexity in actually implementing that. So I don't know if that answers the questions, or if Abby has anything else she wants to add to that.
Oh, I'm good.
Okay. Do we need to say anything more about this? Are there specific suggestions we want to send back to the subcommittee on this issue? Liz?
No, just, I took from Billy's comment that it wasn't finished at the subcommittee level yet. I mean, I don't know if that's the case, but that's what I just took. So I just had a question as to what it meant. I didn't have a specific comment without knowing the answer. So
I think the intent is that there could be revenues through tier 3 of the RES used to help support afforestation efforts across the state.
Anything else to say about this? Okay. So there's a number of other suggestions that or comments that came in through the survey that felt more in the suggestion box more than I really can't live with the way it's written. However, let me pause before we go on to the next bucket of issues to say if anybody has additional things on the sequestration and storing of carbon bucket that they want to bring up now, this is a great time. We can circle back on these issues. I'm just trying to think about how we really jump into the things that require most of our council time. So let me just pause. Any other things that people feel they really are mission critical for them right now on sequestration and storing of carbon? Okay.
If it's okay, David, I just want to note I don't think it is mission critical because of the presence of the word consider. And I think that we will come back to this issue once the RFI or RFP process plays itself out in terms of transparently and accurately accounting for land use related emissions, both on the source and sink side. But I do want to say that the inclusion of that word consider was very important, because I think otherwise the idea of moving towards net emissions accounting in our inventory would be very premature. And I have a significant number of concerns about that that relate to many factors in terms of intent and compliance with the Global Warming Solutions Act on a legal basis, but in some ways, just as importantly, in terms of data quality issues when we compare tracking of land use emissions versus emissions sources that we have much greater confidence about our ability to measure and track over time, specifically with regard to fossil fuel use. So I am reading that as a consideration for further discussion, since it is phrased as such. It is not mission critical, but I just want to be very clear that if someone was suggesting we should minimize the necessity, both legal and moral, to achieve actual pollution reductions from sources by prematurely counting things that we are not confident about how to count in terms of additionality and permanence, that would be a significant concern.
So in the way it's phrased, it's something that we don't need to decide today. It's something to look at in the future after getting the report from the request for proposals, right? Okay. All right. Okay. Anything else on this before we jump into the next bucket of issues from Ag and Ecosystem? All right. So the next set of issues is related to adaptation and building resilience in natural and working lands. And we, again, I did a number of call outs of the things that came in, and there's really kind of two issues that come in. Let me share my screen. There was a number of things around the compact settlement recommendations. And this is interesting because it actually, I know there's pieces here that go into the cross-cutting group, so I'll let folks explain how that's all shaking out. But there was a number of items here about consolidating, harmonizing compact settlement recommendations and making sure we're not inherently putting conflicts into our own initial climate action plan. So there's some things to talk about here. And then the renewable energy siting issues, there was a number of comments on this from different folks, trying to understand, again, the impact on ratepayers for suggestions being made, and also other questions about the specific call out to this in the recommendations. And then also some specific comments around, are there ways to think about finding land use for both ag and solar, or renewable energy, and can we have some smart ideas around that? So these are two buckets of issues that include kind of different things inside them, but these were the two biggies that came out from the survey results as I read them. There are other suggestions and comments down below as well that we can look at, assuming we have time. And obviously folks can shout out their priorities as well. So these were two that came. I'm happy to jump right in. I see Lauren has her hand up, and Lauren, you're kind of in the driver's seat here a little bit. So why don't I turn it over to you if you want to frame any of this up, because I believe you've been very active in shaping these recommendations as well.
Gosh, I don't think I'm framing it up. I just have responses to the first two bullets under the first category. So pathway F should be moved to compact settlement section. Thanks for that comment. I'm on the cross-cutting group working with a team of people on our respective compact settlement strategies. So those compact settlement actions that the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee has identified have been pulled. They just weren't pulled prior to the deadline for us to get this out to the full council. So that you'll see that change have been resolved between now and theoretically next week, or whenever the next iteration of this comes out. And the second one, generally speaking, agree with potentially conflicting strategies. I don't understand the ban all development in river corridors. That is not an action that we proposed, just like we didn't recommend banning thermal heat for biomass use. But we do have something in there about river corridor protections and understanding development. I'm happy to share a one-pager that I crafted, and Chris Campany, whose hand is raised, also commented on that, if that's helpful to understand that action. But I only have answers to those two, David, not a full framing.
That's great. Well, those are really helpful starting places for the conversation. Chris, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll just note that my comment was that third bullet under the first consolidate and harmonize compact settlement. For folk who don't understand, I just want to note that the village centers and downtown, the downtown village centers are really small areas. They're not big enough to accommodate growth. We could pack only so much sausage into those casings. So we also need to look at redevelopment of other already impacted areas, and also like intensification of uses of already impacted areas. Our regional plan speaks to that. And I think that's generally accepted, good planning practice. but I only just want to flag that just to say there are limitations to what we can do under existing kind of compact center designation program. And I'm not knocking those. I'm just saying, but that's why I raised that point there.
In the specific request there or suggestion, Chris, is add this in as well, right? Add this in as well.
If folk are willing, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks. Chris Cochran.
Yeah, Chris Campany. I think if you looked at section 15, the compact settlement section, I think you'll see there's a recommendation to take a look at the designation programs, study them, and look at opportunities to create larger areas. So I think that would address it. I invite you to take a look. I think we shared it with others, but I'll share it with you. I think that addresses that.
I may have missed it, Chris. I'm sorry. I'm trying to keep up with it all.
Oh, brother, I feel you. And then regarding the kind of the tensions between like, allowing reasonable infill in centers versus protecting, upstream and downstream areas, I think it'll take I think a smaller group conversation, I think we can resolve that. I do know there's legislation proposed to try to harmonize these ideas, concepts. I mean, all these goals will take legislative action. So I think there's another opportunity to work on them once the session begins. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Lauren?
A clarification and then a response to something that Chris Cochran just said. I forget we have two Chris's now. First, I should have said, and Billy can probably speak to this more because I think he was planning on framing up Pathway F land use. Pathway F should be moved to compact settlement. There are compact settlement specific actions and strategies that have been pulled, but the full pathway is not being moved to compact settlement because it doesn't necessarily squarely fit under there. And then the response to Chris Cochran, something that you just said, I don't necessarily agree that everything will require legislative action. We have an action recommendation that an existing A&R rule just be slightly tweaked, which wouldn't require legislative action. So just flagging that too. And again, that's the write-up that I have. And Chris Cochran, I'll just share it directly with you too.
Thanks, everyone. I think you've largely covered this, but yeah, I think as Lauren said, some of this will be moved. I think, having flood safe infill is not, and maintaining river corridor protections are not mutually exclusive. As discussed earlier, there's ways to promote infill in existing settlements and deal with fluvial erosion hazards up and downstream. There's a difference between river corridor hazards and inundation flooding, where you can actually build in floodplains safely. So there's some complexity there, but the goal is to not have conflicting recommendations. I don't believe we do. And then, Chris, I think that there are actually significant opportunities within state designated downtowns to increase density and allow for more growth. But your larger point that these areas may or likely won't be enough is a good one. And I think our group would likely be fine expanding this to include neighborhood development areas. So I think we're all on the same page here.
Again, just for the knowledge of the council, like as soon as this thing ends, I go to the Brattleboro Housing Advisory Committee. And I think they're identifying housing needs, in like pretty immediate term of like 800 units. And so that's going to need to be, and we're working on a project on existing campuses that could like accommodate potentially maybe 500 of those. But that's a lot for downtown Brattleboro to try to absorb. So that's just the kind, we're talking big numbers. And so that I just wanted to share that with the council so that folk understood what we're talking about.
Great. So it sounds like in this conversation, Lauren's provided some clarity about the first bullets, as have others. Chris Campany has clarified what he's after and is going to look for that language and see if it's in there, and then work maybe with Chris Cochran to adjust that language if needed. Are there other things we need to do or say to address this top bullet here? I'm looking at the chat as well. I'm trying to make sense. Julie, Secretary Moore, can you explain a little bit more of that second chat you have right now about the litmus test? I didn't fully understand that.
Yeah, so there are a couple of places where we reference existing infrastructure in a way that could be seen as like a precursor to infill development. I just think we wanna-
Precursor or prerequisite? Sorry.
Prerequisite, I guess, is the right way, because it's existing infrastructure, right? It doesn't say that you need to have sufficient infrastructure. And I'm just concerned that that's gonna sort of further narrow and exacerbate some of what Chris Campany, I think, is flagged, is we have some areas that may be ripe for additional development, but we require investments in core infrastructure first. And I don't think we want to preclude those.
I think I understand the point.
So it's line 622, 623 is the place I was able to quickly find in the document.
Okay, coming in. Give me a sec. So I guess the point, if I understand it, it's you don't want to, I can't believe there's 623 lines.
That's only
what
page
you're not,
34 of 62, David.
yeah. Okay, yeah. So the point being that you want to create the opportunity for that infrastructure to be built, not just that it's existing already. Is that okay? So if I stop sharing this screen and go to this other screen, this piece. In areas with adequate local laws, existing infrastructure. Right. Okay. So is there something to be done with that? I mean, Abby or Billy, can you imagine a sort of quick fix on this? Because I'm not quite I bet the intent isn't sort of what Julie's concerned about, right?
I think you could just change existing infrastructure to adequate or sufficient.
It's an easy fix.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Great. Are there other things we want to do about this issue, the issues of compact settlement? Okay.
There are lots, but more than you don't have enough time.
Yeah. We know that there's a cross-cutting conversation happening around that, right? So this is not, this is not the only time this is going to happen, right? Great, Joey.
Well, I guess my question is, and maybe it's for the cross-cutting. I'm just wondering if there's clear definitions, because we've identified this too, but maybe if we across the subcommittees and through the cross-cutting can define what compact settlement is and what, or work with existing, designated downtowns and just make that clear for the public and for ourselves. Because I'm thinking about that in the context of the recommendation that Chris Campany made in terms of NDAs. This may be helpful to have more clear definitions that flow throughout the plan. That's it. And so maybe we can talk about in the cross-cutting where it's, because it's in each of the subcommittees.
Does that seem like for the folks who are participating in that cross-cutting group, does that seem like a good, task from Joey? Like, let's be real clear on definitions as we're talking about these issues of compact settlement, other things like that. I know Jane's been helping to lead the cross-cutting folks, and there's some of you have been involved in it too.
I think it's a good goal. I think it's hard to do.
Okay. All right. Anything else on compact settlement? All right. Let's do a quick piece on, or not quick, let's do a piece on the renewable energy siting issues, which is Pathway F, Strategy 5. Again, this is a similar comment we've seen elsewhere, which is let's be careful. We're not framing this only as creating new costs for ratepayers. And again, thinking about cost effectiveness in some of these recommendations, and some clarity on definitions of this, and then a request to think about sort of co-locations of renewable siting and ag and how that works well. And then a comment, these are just sort of several comments I grouped together. One was, so why are we calling this out specifically versus anything else that might happen on agricultural lands? So those are the things that were raised up. And I wonder, as a starting place, Abby and Billy, if you want to say any quick reactions to these kinds of reactions, these comments.
I think, again, this is an area where it just lays out very clearly the, you know, the trickiness of the nuances of how we move through this. I think I guess I would need to better understand. Liz and I have had at least one side conversation about this once, but not recently. And so like I would need to better understand the concern about the equity issues of cost, because that is really relevant. But I think some of this, at least from our subcommittee's perspective, could be framed almost in a type of a social cost of carbon framework. In other words, if we're taking prime ag land out of production to put, which I know is not typically what happens, but if we are, what is the broad scale impact to society by doing that? Additionally, I know for, like, I can speak from personal experience on our farm when putting in solar energy, you know, we need every single scrap of land that we have. There are massive issues of land access. And so, you know, for farmers, if the farmer agrees to take the grazing scenario, which is, I know Chad and I, again, have spoken about this. I know that this is I had to testify about this the other day in House and Senate Ag as well. Farmers are tapped. So unless you're going to give them the labor force to raise what oftentimes is an entirely different animal, sheep, you know, there aren't a lot of farmers doing sheep at the moment, and sheep are an entirely different animal. They require a different set of veterinary care, infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. And so certainly if the farmer is open to that, I think that's the decision that needs to happen between the farmer and the developer. I think what we're trying to think about here are the tensions of maybe it costs more in the short term to put renewable energy siting on existing infrastructure, because again, in our case, we certainly had to invest in the barn on which we did that, right? It cost more to build out the roofing structure to host the panels, but in the long run, it's so much better for everything because it's on an existing infrastructure. It doesn't take up any land. It's much easier to manage that way. And so I think that that was a lot of where those types of framing are going or coming from, is sort of this, what do we lose when if we're cutting down, you know, acres of forest to put up solar panels, for example, or wind turbines. And, you know, that this is again, one of those places where it's a really complicated conversation. And a lot of times I think we don't necessarily have everybody at the table that needs to be there to sort of fully vet the levels of nuance.
Thanks, Abby. So how can this council provide some good input right now on this? In addition to sort of the bullet points that were on the screen there, are there pieces of input that would be really helpful right now? Chris Campany?
I'd be interested to hear what June has to say, but you could actually look at what standards regional and municipal energy plans have to meet with regard to siting, because that presumably are the rules for the state as far as energy siting are concerned, with regard to how regions and municipalities are supposed to develop policy that's supposed to be given substantial deference in Public Utility Commission hearings.
June, do you want to say anything about that?
Do I want to? I'm going to say something, yes. So Chris, what you just recited is accurate as far as I know in terms of existing law. I think what we're doing here is imagining the world that we think is necessary in order to comply with our statutory assignment, which is to come up with a plan that will achieve recommendations that will in turn result in rules that are supposed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to a certain degree, fixed in law. So none of that's optional. I should have thought that the subcommittee's deliberations would have been informed by the existence of that body of law that you just cited. If that is not the case, then certainly it would be worth the subcommittee's time, I think, to look at that and see if that affects any of the language that's been put into the draft we have so far. One of our options is to recommend statutory changes, which I would have to think includes possibly alterations to Act 174, which is the basis for the framework that you just described, Chris. I don't have an opinion sitting here right now as to whether I would recommend such changes. I think Act 174, as it has been implemented so far, has had a short life so far, but to my knowledge, a successful one. And so I guess my advice would be that the subcommittee just have a second look to make sure that they haven't overlooked that body of work. And if fault has been found with it, such that something is being suggested here is at odds with that body of work, then I haven't heard anything to that effect. And I would be very leery of turning my back on that body of work. I hope that helps you.
Yeah, and do you mind, Liz, if I just jump in real quick? I just want to be clear. I encourage folks to look at the actual language and the recommendations and not the comments, because that's exactly what the recommended language says. It says to look at the effectiveness of the Act 74 citing criteria, whether it's accomplishing the intended goals of reducing impacts to natural working lands. And then it goes on to encourage further incentives and potentially mandates to kind of bake in those overarching land use goals in our siting policy. So it doesn't say that you can't put solar on farm fields. It doesn't make these kind of broad declaratory statements. It doubles down on the exact process Commissioner Tierney and Chris, you suggested we build upon. So certainly we welcome specific comments on how we can improve the language for it to be more clear, effective. I wasn't super involved in this piece, given this is what I do as a day job. And it was interesting to see that many of the other subcommittee members came to these conclusions on their own. But I think that the big point is that we're somewhat at an inflection point where renewable energy generation is a significant part of our landscape. We now know it will be an even greater and permanent part of our landscape, and a real interest in our subcommittee to do it right, to do it well, not create false conflicts, to acknowledge where there are opportunities to site energy without impacting natural resources, and acknowledge if those good sites are no longer available, then we have to make different decisions, but not to just make those decisions without good information, planning, and due diligence.
Thanks, Billy. Liz?
Yeah, so I had no comment, Billy, on the Act 174 recommendation, and agree that the way the draft characterizes it is as you just stated. I did provide specific comments on the draft, and it really just goes to something else you said a second ago. You said encourage incentives, and I was simply pointing out that in the draft, it actually says require. And if we're going to use the word require here or elsewhere, as I've said before, I think we just need to be really clear on what it is we're asking to be, voting on. And if it's going to be require incentives, then we should, in my view, or my recommendation is that we at least broaden the way we're talking about the incentives. For example, Abby and I had a great conversation about how REAP grants can be utilized by farmers. The phrase require incentives without some nuance or additional language around it can just be misunderstood or too narrowly understood. And that would be the concern here, just specifically that the draft either use the language you just did, which is encourage, or if it is going to say require, that we broaden it to ensure that we're benefiting, for example, from any, federal grant and other opportunities that exist, so that it's not necessarily electric customers or in any other, you could transfer the setting elsewhere, any other group of customers that's paying, rather than potentially broader sources that are better from an overall equity point of view.
Thank you for that clarification and a good point. And we can certainly change that required language based on your comments if that's where the group's at.
So that's a good point. Where is the group at? Does that, hearing what Liz said and how Billy's explained it as well, are folks on board with sort of the pathway that Liz is encouraging Billy and Abby to go down on this? Any concerns about that?
Just to be clear, there's a separate point in their cost effectiveness where it does say the state will have to consider a combination of greater incentives, but then on the left side, it says require. So it was just meant to be a comment that y'all, when you go through the draft again, just kind of think about what it is you're recommending, and to the extent it's require, you either make it consistent with the other places so it's not require, or broaden it.
Thanks, Liz. Do others have a different opinion on this that we need to address right now? Or is this saying clearly what the council needs to say now on this issue?
David, I just want to clarify something, because you've been using that language all afternoon, and I've just been genuinely confused, and I'm trying really hard listening. I keep getting the feeling that you're tying these things up so that, in essence, I have no option later to exercise my discretion as a counselor. Am I wrong about that? I mean, when I've seen the final product, I look at the whole report and I exercise my vote and say, am I for this or not?
That's correct.
It's just not clear to me where we are in this process. And I feel like you're tying things off such that I don't have an opportunity to come back later after I've seen the entire plan and to say, here's where I stand with these recommendations. So am I misreading the situation?
Let me describe what I understand the situation is, and the same as for last week when we're going through cross-sector mitigation. And that is, we are not agreeing on a package of recommendations, pathways, strategies, actions today. That is not what we're doing here. What we're doing here is doing our best to lift up the issues that this council wants to make sure the subcommittee has clear, which are issues of concern. And if we're able to, in this space right now, address those concerns in ways that feel good to folks, when we will agree to this is when we have the full package and we have that in front of us. And then
when we will evaluate, not when we will agree to it, right?
Excuse me. Yes.
Thank you. Okay.
Yes, when we will evaluate about our agreement with it. Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Correct.
Okay, then
we have the full thing.
You've answered my question. Thank you.
Okay, great. Chris?
Yeah, I apologize if I took people down the wrong path by raising Act 174, but to Billy's point, I put this in the chat, but I was trying to respond to the comments and provide some context for the council. I'm assuming some folk here have never heard of Act 174 and the standards and the work that's been done and the need to kind of revisit those and determine if they're going to achieve the Global Warming Solutions Act goals, objectives, yada, 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 yada. So I think this is just I'm not complaining about the process, but I think this is the challenge of not being able necessarily to do the side-by-side of the comments versus the language being responded to in our Hollywood Squares format. We're doing the best we can, but that's what that was all about. Yeah, I'll try to do a better job of that, but yeah, didn't mean to take up too much time.
Thanks, Chris.
Well, I didn't think you did, Chris. I thought it was a great point. So whatever, I'm done.
Thanks. All right. Rich?
I think Chris made a great point, and I thank him for it. I just hope that the text, when we get done with it, doesn't come across as saying that there cannot be a negative impact, period, on prime ag land or on forest land in order to locate distributed renewables in Vermont. It clearly should say that we should have processes in place to minimize negative impacts. And that's the way Vermont law has been written in from Act 250 through the energy siting laws and the planning laws. But that there is a real trade-off between reliance on in-state renewables on the one hand and an imperative that wouldn't allow us to accept that there's going to be some negative impacts from doing that. So we just have to be realistic about the degree to which we can seek to minimize negative impacts while maximizing cost effectiveness and maximizing emission reductions, without tying our hands so tightly that we find it impossible to locate renewable resources almost anywhere. I think you all are probably headed in that direction. So maybe I'm saying what everybody already understands, but I think it's important that when we get done with it, the text, reads as though we could actually achieve our goals.
David, could I ask Rich a question about that?
Of course.
So Rich, from your lips to my ear, would you agree that we're also aspiring to distribute those negative impacts, if they must be, equitably? Because it seems to me that that has been one of the major themes of our discourse recently, and particularly today, that we are not being sufficiently mindful of the mandate for equity. And so it harkens for me back to our conversation earlier this summer in August, I think, where I was raising concerns about the screening tool on this very topic. And I came away from that with the feeling that I had not fully achieved my goal, which was to make clear that we have to be accepting of negative impacts, because they inescapably are part of any decision we make in this realm. But that the objective, therefore, has to be newly aware of and committed to ensuring that those negative impacts, when they happen, are at least not inequitably distributed. Would you agree with that?
Oh, well, I absolutely agree with that. Overwhelmingly agree with that. And we need to recognize that that's going to be a consideration in the compact development policy as well. Yeah. I mean, there are lots of people who will feel negatively impacted by a compact settlements process. And as Chris Campany pointed out, our capacity to insist that everything be compactly developed is going to affect a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. So, but that's a parallel conversation, but certainly with respect to the location of energy infrastructure, I agree with you completely.
I like that best.
So those are very helpful comments that we can bring back to the group. I think absolutely the goal is to the extent possible, avoid and minimize impacts of energy generation on significant natural resources. I think we believe, based on the existing state and regional energy planning that's occurred, there are ample opportunities to do that currently. And we want to just make sure that whatever this group does encourages that excellent siting. We're also mindful of the work that your consultants did and was presented to you last week related to the carbon budget and the state's prospects of going net zero by 2050 and the significant reliance on our forests to achieve that goal, and that we need to effectively maintain the kind of area of forests and the amount of storage and sequestration they're currently providing to hit that target. So, this is not just about where we put energy generation, but what assets we have existing that we need to retain to be resilient and adaptive into the future. So But great points, everyone. We'll do our best to incorporate those in our next draft.
Okay. I'm wondering if folks would be interested in spending just 5 minutes or more, but on the next bucket of issues, which is around the mitigation. In here, we really had very few comments. Before I jump to mitigation, there are other comments that came in on adaptation and building resilience in natural working lands. Like I said, they felt more like comments, suggestions than say things we need to discuss. But I'm open to, if anybody has something else that's burning right now for them on this issue of the adaptation in natural working lands, feel free to shout it out now if there's something else in this bucket of issues.
I don't know at what point you want me to tackle the food security and climate change piece, but if now is the time to do that, I'm happy to do that if it's appropriate.
Yeah, why don't you? Because that's something that I believe there's even in the chat today as well. I think Secretary Moore put a comment in the chat about that. So yeah, why don't we do that, Abby?
Yeah, so similar to what we've all experienced, or lots of people experienced during COVID, our food system in this country is, and the chains, the aggregation, the distribution of food in this country is, one, highly dependent on greenhouse gases, and two, an infrastructure that supports that, and two, is very brittle. And so in the face of a changing climate, as I understand it from learning about other places where they've been dealing with the impacts of climate change for decades now, the first thing that falls is the food system, and food security is gone. And I think particularly concerning about that is the statistic that 1 in 3 Vermonters are food insecure, or at least were during the pandemic. And I think, to Susanna Davis's point, I've heard her make in other forums, you know, this is a state that's considered for its agricultural economy, and sort of that's one of our calling cards. And so to have food insecure folks in this state seems like potentially we're not really meeting our marks in the way that we really need to do. And so, yes, this is a broader issue that I know for some, it seems like a stretch to connect to climate change. But I think when you look at the Midwest, when you look at the Pacific Northwest, et cetera, you see the crop damage that's happened there. You understand what farmers are dealing with internationally, and frame this in a global context. This is one of the biggest issues we could potentially face. Additionally, I think one of the things in a historical context that's interesting to consider is that, you know, during the Great Depression, my understanding of how Vermonters were resilient was due in part to the thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of tiny small farms that existed at that point, and the fact that you literally could feed yourself. And so I not to borrow trouble, but I sense we're headed towards a world where that will become more and more imperative. And so thinking about regionalized food systems and how to become resilient in that method of our infrastructure, in spite of the fact that I think for, you know, many people, food seems ubiquitous, it is certainly not. And that needs to be deeply considered as we think about what it's going to look like, what we can produce, what our lands can do. You know, last year we didn't have enough feed because of drought. This year we had more feed than we could do anything with, but it's all terrible. Those are very real things, and they have massive impacts in terms of how people are fed. And I think it's partially our removal from food systems that makes us so that we don't fully understand sort of how this over here means that I don't get food on my table. But we really need to be considering those things as climate change becomes more and more impactful in our daily lives. I hope that helps for context of the importance of the issue in this climate action plan.
Thanks, Abby. So Sue, did you have your hand up on this issue?
Yes.
Great, well, go ahead, please.
I just want to thank you, Abby, and I did see the recommendations, and I want you to know that I'm actually involved, or as a response to COVID, there's been a statewide food mass feeding group and a partnership, and a number of things have evolved from that, including a plan that is currently underway, just beginning through the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund. And it is connected to a regional network of sort of looking at food systems and food security in our climate changing world. So I think your idea is A, good, and B, sort of been started. So my only comment is that we coordinate and maybe fold that effort into this recommendation. Thanks so much for bringing it up.
If at a later point, Sue, you can send me the name of that organization, I'm happy to fold it into our recommendations in that regard. A lot of what we tried to do in this component is, there's some legislatively appointed working groups that are sort of tackling this already. There's the PES working group, which again seems separate, but isn't. There's the Future of Ag Commission that the governor put together. They're working off of the Farm to Plate strategic plan. And so acknowledging some of the holes and critiques that have come from that plan from particularly the BIPOC community, we're thinking that is a good place to start us. And definitely encouraging coordination through all of those different efforts. So I'm happy to add in another component of that if you have a specific recommendation to an organization, but definitely not wanting to reinvent the wheel here, but instead build on the work that I think COVID made us think we need to be starting towards, and just encourage that continue.
Great. Joey?
I'll be brief and just say thanks. I think it's really important. You framed it out well. Why, Abby, and clearly a resilience issue. I also just think it speaks to what Sue mentioned, and you just sort of underscored, Abby, the need for coordination. So among these issues, because they're so connected. So that's under the cross-cutting, but it seems like it's embedded a little bit in yours. So just wanted to say that briefly, and thanks.
Great. Is there anything else folks want to share on this issue? Concerns, how to keep it squarely in our mandate? Anything else? Okay. Great. So it is time to break for public comment. We didn't go into the third bucket in terms of the mitigation pieces. I will say what came in over the survey was fairly easily resolved and sort of like one-on-one resolution. So I think let's see how we deal with that maybe tomorrow morning. And I'll have a conversation with Jane and others about how to structure tomorrow's agenda. And after public comment, perhaps if counselors have some comments of that, we'll do that. But I just want to say before we go to public comment, again, so much work has gone into getting us to having this conversation from the subcommittee, from the co-chairs of subcommittee. And so we just need to shout that out loudly, that it's an enormous amount of work and a huge amount of work to also read through all of that product of the subcommittee. So thanks everyone for that. Okay. All right, so let's do some public comment. I see some hands up already. Mary Bryant, why don't you go ahead, please?
Thank you for the opportunity to be here and share some thoughts. I am on the select board in Thetford Center, Vermont, and we were asked to sign the 350 petition, which we did. But before I go into that, I want to thank you all for this monumental effort that you're doing for this subject that needs so much thought and concern and bold action. So thank you. And I also want to thank 350.org because I do believe they've sort of crystallized a lot of concerns that citizens have regarding the issues that are in this letter. And I would like to read you the letter, and I would like to go through a little shortly how we came to decide to vote for it. Dear Vermont climate counselors, thank you for the important and challenging work you are doing to develop climate action plan that will provide the roadmap to make Vermont a just and bold leader in addressing the global climate crisis. What you develop will impact the lives of everyday Vermonters in coming decades and for generations to come. We are asking you to seize this opportunity to develop a plan that will not only drastically curb greenhouse gas emissions, but also improves the lives of all Vermonters, particularly those of us most socially and economically vulnerable. Toward that end, we ask that you develop a climate action plan for the people that, is aligned with the just transition principles developed by the Council's Just Transition Subcommittee, which I've read and I am very impressed by them. That you count all greenhouse gases emissions accurately to ensure our actions are impactful and proportional to the scale of the crisis, including the state emissions and methane from Hydro-Quebec. And I have to say, for myself, I've heard in the past recently that Vermont has the bold statement that we have about 80% renewable energy. But that, to me, that doesn't hold true when you look at things like the methane that Hydro-Quebec releases. So I'm glad that we might be having an eye on that. That we will establish a 10-year mass weatherization program for Vermont's housing stock and prioritize the needs of low-income and BIPOC communities. And I know here in Thetford, we've had many citizens groups building window inserts, weatherization. This is all so important. And when I hear you talk about this, of doing this, I don't know how we can all move forward without helping the low income and BIPOC population. That we develop a public transportation system in urban and rural communities. And I know here in our community, we are about 15 miles from the Upper Valley, White River Junction, Hanover. We have tried for decades to get a rural commuting system and we have been unable. So that would be very helpful. That we provide access and resources to farmers who want to practice regenerative agriculture and prioritizing BIPOC farmers first. I myself annually go to the NOFA, the Northeast Organic Farming Association conference, and there are many young farmers who want to start doing small farms, scalable farms that are giving local food. And the biggest hurdle for most of them is being able to afford land. So I don't know how we would go forward without helping with that, as well as they would be, holding greenhouse gases in the soil, which is something that is of almost a free service in the soil if the farming's done right. And that we take the renewable natural gas off the table as a potential solution and incentivize just transition renewable energy solutions like net metering, community solar incentives, heat pumps, and geothermal, prioritizing our low income and BIPOC communities. 7, keep and puts carbon back in the ground by protecting ecosystems and preventing Vermont state lands and Green Mountain National Forest from large scale logging. And I will say, as a select board member, this brought to mind that we have many town forests, and that should be something that we are doing as well as a town, to looking at our forest as a carbon sink for greenhouse gases. That we create a fair and bold funding mechanism for this people's climate action that doesn't pass on the costs of this transition to future generations. Advises the legislature to pass the following legislative initiatives in 2022. Senator Ram's Environmental Justice Bill, appropriate funding for Climate Action Plan, and any bills that support the implementation of the Just Transition Climate Action Plan, and the Vermont Renews bills addressing food justice, local income, weatherization, green justice zones, including the Land Access and Opportunity Act. And one of the reasons, a couple of reasons why I can say our select board felt very confident in passing this, and it was a unanimous vote, is about 4 years ago, we had a non-binding resolution in our town to do things like not allow any more natural gas, to address climate issues. And it was overwhelmingly passed almost unanimously in our town meeting. There was about 2 or 3 people who didn't vote for it. And then before this was brought to the select board, some people were from the Energy Committee went out to where all roads meet in every town, the recycling center and the transfer station. They got, in one morning, they had over 8% of the town signing these petitions, these cards. And that was over 200 signatures in a day. So I believe I am representing a small microcosm of Vermont. And again, I thank you for listening and thank you for all the work that you are doing.
Thank you, Mary. Really appreciate you attending today's meeting and those comments. And I hope the letter is something that we have already received or will receive. So please send that along if we don't already have it.
I will be very happy to do that. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. I see hands from Vanessa and from Zach. So Vanessa, go ahead. Vanessa Rule, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I just want to say that the letter that the Thetford Select Board signed on to was signed by 200 community leaders and elected officials at this point. And that's going to be growing. We started working on that part of the project after we delivered the postcards on September 28th. And I want to just, I know you're way into the process at this point, but I do hope that you'll take the fact that, Vermonters deeply, deeply care about what you're doing. They're watching, and they're going to be at the table as, for the next steps. And they really want to be represented. They want their interests represented for corporate interests. And so I just felt important to just say that it's not just the Thetford Select Board, but many community leaders across Vermont who are really ready to mobilize and, be at the table to make sure that we get the plan that this state deserves. And we need the state to be a leader, which it currently isn't. Thank you.
Thanks, Vanessa. Thanks very much. Zach Porter, go ahead, please.
Thank you. My name is Zach Porter. I'm the director of Standing Trees, which is a group that you may have heard of. It was founded in the past year by concerned citizens across this state and increasingly citizens across New England who are worried about the direction of forest management and concerned that proposals related to forest management and things like the Climate Action Plan aren't following the best science at the moment. And just for a bit of introduction, I have been participating in just about every one of the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee meetings since the very beginning of this process. I don't believe I've made comment in a full Climate Council meeting up until now, but the subcommittee knows me well at this point. And I want to also thank you all for the incredible amount of time and energy that you've put into this process. It's a lot to cover in a short period of time, and you're in the 11th hour now, and appreciate this chance to make a comment today. There's some great things in the proposed sections from the Agriculture and Ecosystems Subcommittee. We haven't gotten to the land use section yet, but I want to commend the subcommittee for taking steps to push Vermont towards the targets that are within Vermont conservation design for old forests. That's a fantastic component for the Climate Action Plan to include, as well as provisions to improve the use value appraisal program to make it more equitable so that any landowner in Vermont who otherwise qualifies for participation in UVA can manage their land the way they choose, not just through logging, but also through allowing their lands to rewild and all of the benefits that brings. So really want to just point those two out in particular as I think fantastic components that the subcommittee has put forward, and I certainly hope that the council as a whole will agree to and move forward. I want to say as Standing Trees, we very much support a wood products industry in Vermont. What we want to make sure is that the way that we manage our forests follows the best science that's out there. And we are concerned because there's a difference between supporting an appropriately sized wood products industry and claiming that wood products and biofuels like biomass for electricity are climate solutions, which they are not. They are false climate solutions. And something that is really alarming to Standing Trees is the degree to which the carbon budget, which has had very little discussion in the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee, the degree to which the carbon budget focuses on sequestration as opposed to accumulation and storage. And I want to make this really clear. The science does not support this notion that we should be aiming for increased sequestration. What we know is that we need to be aiming for more carbon storage. more carbon sink in our forest land is what we should be aiming for with our carbon budget, with the design of the climate action plan. But the way we are modeling right now does not really allow us to take the advantage of the full ecological potential of our forests to meet the climate crisis. And that's not just mitigation, but that's resilience, that's reducing floods, that's reducing the impacts of droughts. All of these things can best be accomplished by allowing Vermont's forests to grow older. And this is what the science has borne out in recent years, with just paper after paper after paper about the resilience of older, which really what I mean is, restoring the natural ecosystems of Vermont, which if you have never read Vermont Conservation Design, a report that Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation and Vermont Fish and Wildlife co-produced in 2018, says that only a fraction of the state's forests, less than 0.1%, bear any resemblance to the forests that were here pre-European settlement, the ones that we really need to get back to if we want to accomplish what we are setting out to accomplish here. Not to mention reducing our water quality problems and all the other crises that are compounded by climate change. So I'm concerned that it's 11:59 in the climate action plan development process, and some of the foundational documents that are guiding your efforts, like the carbon budget, are fundamentally flawed. We are not looking at, for example, biomass electricity as with full life cycle accounting in the carbon budget. It's looking at it as if it was carbon neutral. It's not clear to me that we're taking into the full impacts of timber harvest, which has been shown to be a greater impact on carbon fluxes in New England than conversion from forest to non-forest land. None of that appears to be showing up in the modeling that we've done. And I don't see a significant kind of effort to model what Vermont could accomplish by putting more of its forest land into old forests than we have today. So we are going to be submitting substantial written comments rather than kind of rattling off statistics to you, because I know that you are all worn out after several hours of intense meetings here this afternoon. We're going to be submitting written comments, and I hope you'll take a close look at those. I will just add that Bill Muma, who was the lead author on 5 IPCC reports, is somebody who has offered to visit with the Climate Council, visit with the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee, going back to the beginning of this process. He's somebody who gets the climate science behind forest carbon better than almost anybody else out there. And this council or in the subcommittee did not take advantage of that offer from Bill Muma to come speak. Time is running out. His offer still stands. I hope that you might consider having an expert like Professor Muma come and share, really the nuances here, which I think are lost on a lot of people, between sequestration and storage, and why storage is what we should be aiming for here in Vermont, and all the co-benefits that provides. So I appreciate your time and look forward to future opportunities to communicate with you all about what forests can do for us here in Vermont. Thanks, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Zach. Okay. All right. Thanks, folks. Anybody else who's been observing our meeting today who might want to make a comment? Okay, great. All right, folks. So in terms of next steps, we do have an extraordinary meeting tomorrow. And on that agenda is to go through pieces that we didn't pick up today. And I am happy to work with co-chairs over email right after this meeting to prioritize some of those conversations. Also, council members, if you want to shoot me an email about priority conversations you'd like to have that we didn't get to today, that would be very helpful. If we don't need the full 2 hours tomorrow, we won't use it. We'll use just the amount of time we need to work through the issues, so you feel like you've had a chance to give these 2 subcommittees the time of the thinking time you want to give it. Okay, so we'll see you tomorrow morning. And as always, we will expect revised drafts from these subcommittees within a week or so. And we are in, as people have reminded us, we're in something of the 11th hour, and we're moving fast at this point. However, we are if you felt it today we had a calm conversation about some key issues, and that was really helpful. Are there any other next steps that I'm missing? Either that Jane or anybody else wants to put out on the table before we finish up today?
I think you got it, David. This is Jane on our phone. Thank you so much for all of that. And just a reminder that, like last week, Marion and I will be working to post a significant slug of documents tomorrow. That includes the cross-cutting pathways that were referenced today, as well as components from just transitions and funding and finance for implementation, and some components around the impacts of climate change and the economic opportunities around them. So there'll be significant updates, as well as cross-sector has completed the table of responsiveness survey, and that will be posted along with updated drafts from all of the sectors for cross-sector tomorrow as well.
Great.
So thank you.
Thanks, Jane. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for hanging in there. We'll see you tomorrow. This is a very intense 2.5 weeks we have coming up in front of us. So thanks, everybody, for hanging in. We're doing it slowly but surely. Have a great evening. We'll see you in the morning. Take care, everybody.